Hi guys! Tonight we're going to wander into a place you don't normally imagine as part of a castle tour. Forget grand banquets and glittering halls for a moment. Instead, picture yourself padding along a stone corridor, the air sharp with winter frost, your breath puffing white clouds in front of your face. Your hands fumble at the edges of your cloak, trying to tuck the wool closer against your body, but the icy draft seeps through anyway. You are not heading for the chapel or the armory. No, you are desperately seeking relief, the kind no feast or fire can postpone. The truth is, when you live in a medieval castle in the depths of a European winter, your bladder doesn't care about romance or history. You have to go, and you probably won't survive this comfortably. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening while tucked under blankets, let me know your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. You shuffle forward across uneven flagstones, the cold rising right through the soles of your shoes. These corridors were never meant for warmth. They were defensive arteries of the fortress, all business and no comfort. The wind whistles through arrow slits and door gaps, reminding you that insulation is a modern luxury. Imagine the sound a hollow moan echoing down the hallway mixed with the dull drip of water where melted snow sneaks in through the roofline. Each step is an argument with your own body. Do you hold it in and curl back by the fire, or do you face the walk of frosted dread toward the garderobe? The term sounds almost elegant, doesn't it? Garderobe literally to guard the robes. It hints at the medieval custom of hanging clothing in these small toilet chambers because the odor was believed to repel moths. That's your mainstream fact for the evening. Clothes, closets, and bathrooms were sometimes the same space, a peculiar overlap of hygiene and wardrobe. The thought of silken gowns and wool cloaks absorbing the tang of ammonia and worse is enough to wrinkle your nose. Still, that was their logic. You push on. The chill intensifies as you near the outer walls because most toilets were built in projections overhanging the moat. That meant the room you're entering isn't cozy or central, it's stuck like a stone box on the edge of the castle, exposed to every icy gust. Your fingers brush the rough lintel as you pass through. Inside, the air is biting, thick with a mix of damp stone and faint, sour undertones. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some visitors claimed that these little chambers were among the safest places to gossip. The theory was that no one would linger to eavesdrop in the biting cold, so quick exchanges of secret news often happened while two people crossed paths near the garderobe. Imagine it whispers about alliances or affairs traded just outside the stinkiest room in the fortress. It makes you smile, even as your toes numb against the floor. You lower yourself onto the seat, which is really just a wide stone ledge with a wooden cover, pierced by one or two rounded holes. The sensation is unforgettable. The sharp sting of freezing air rushing upward, the cruel kiss of icy wood or stone against your thighs. Historians still argue whether nobles lined their seats with furs in the coldest months, or whether that's a later romantic notion. If they did, the servants surely envied them, trudging to the same drafty chutes without so much as a cushion. Outside, snow swirls against the wall. Inside, you sit in the hollow quiet, listening to the wind and the trickle of unseen water below. Every sound feels amplified in the silence of stone. The castle might hold hundreds of souls, but right now it's just you, perched over a void, wondering how much longer you can bear the cold before your knees start to tremble. The act itself is universal, humbling, and in winter rather punishing. You can't rush it, you can't delay it, and when you're done, you pull your clothes back into place quickly, desperate to return to warmth. Your cloak clings with the damp chill of the air, and you swear that the smell lingers on your skin. That, then, is your first true taste of castle life in the harshest season. Not feasts, not jousts, not banners snapping in the wind, but the endless, shivering walk to a place no one talks about in fairy tales. You begin to understand why chamber pots by the bed became so precious, why servants muttered about their duties with weary faces, why entire architectural features were dedicated just to funneling waste away from the noble halls. And as you leave the tiny chamber, edging back into the corridor with its sighing draughts and flickering torches, you realize that your night has only just begun. The cold stone, the pungent air, the lingering shiver, they set the stage for every other indignity and quirk of medieval toilet life we're about to explore. You're still hugging yourself as you shuffle away from that first frigid encounter, but you can't quite stop thinking about the design of the chamber you just left behind. The garderobe, as it's so politely named, was never meant for comfort. It was meant for efficiency or, more bluntly, for getting waste out of the castle as quickly as possible. And in winter, that design feature turned into a personal torment. You push open another heavy wooden door, its iron strap hinges creaking, and step into a different garderobe. The cold hits immediately. The chamber is barely larger than a closet, with a tiny slit in the wall for light. That slit doubles as a vent, so a stream of freezing air pours through it like a knife. You feel the air curl around your ankles, tugging at your legs with the relentlessness of an invisible hand. It's as if the outside winter has been invited straight into this stone cubby. That draft isn't an accident. Castle builders knew waste carried more than just a bad smell, it carried disease. So they designed these little latrines with intentional airflow. Ventilation, they called it, though you'd probably call it an Arctic wind. A mainstream historical fact here. Archaeologists have found garderobes built in external projections known as garderobe towers, carefully planned to funnel odors away from living spaces. In summer, that meant some relief from stench. In winter, it meant your backside froze. You lower yourself again, shivering as the cold rises up the shaft. The wooden seat is slick with condensation, rimmed with a touch of frost. The draft whistles upward with surprising strength, as though the moat itself is breathing at you. You clench your cloak tighter around your shoulders, but there's no true escape. The cold is everywhere. Here's a quirky little aside. Records suggest some people tried to cheat the draft by stuffing bits of cloth or hay into the seat hole when it wasn't in use. It helped reduce the upward rush of icy air, but it also risked clogging the chute, which no servant wanted to deal with. Imagine the muttering, the curses, the freezing hands prying out soggy lumps of hay because someone couldn't stand the wind in the night. And yet, the experience wasn't just about physical discomfort, it was about vulnerability. As you perch there, exposed to the elements, you're aware of how precarious this whole arrangement feels. The shaft below is just open space, stone, chute, air, and then, if you're lucky, water. There are tales of enemies sneaking into castles through poorly guarded garderobe shafts, using the very chutes meant for waste as secret tunnels. Historians still debate whether such stories are exaggerated or rare, but real, but the thought lingers. While you're shivering, trousers down, you're technically sitting on one of the weakest defensive points of the castle. The soundscape adds to the unease. From below you hear trickles of water, maybe the faint echo of wind whipping past the chute. The air carries scents dulled by frost but never erased, sharp, sour, earthy. You might even catch the faint murmur of voices from the courtyard if the garderobe juts out above it. Imagine then, using this place while knowing your every grunt or sigh could be overheard by anyone unlucky enough to pass beneath. Back in the corridor, torches hiss and pop, their warmth a weak promise compared to the roaring fire in the great hall. But the garderobe remains, its icy breath, a reminder that winter in a castle didn't care whether you were king or kitchen servant. Everyone faced the draft. The difference was in how often you dared to face it. Some would hold back, waiting until the last possible moment, shivering and shifting uncomfortably at feasts, just to avoid the icy punishment of that little room. You picture yourself doing the same. You hesitate at the doorway knowing you'll have to return eventually, but already bargaining with yourself. Maybe less ale at supper, maybe an extra blanket and a chamber pot within reach. Anything to avoid that piercing cold rushing up from below, making every visit an ordeal. And so you trudge onward, realizing that in the Middle Ages, The simple act of using the toilet wasn't just inconvenient. It was a test of endurance against the elements, a nightly gamble between dignity and frostbite. You wander deeper into the castle, the stone walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering, until you come across another little chamber carved into the thickness of the outer wall. This one feels different, not so much a room as a ledge built into the fortress itself. You step inside and realize you're standing over nothingness. That's what strikes you first. The medieval toilet isn't a comfortable wooden chair with armrests, or even a seat shaped with consideration for the human body. It is a board, sometimes stone, often rough, set over an open shaft that drops straight down into the moat or the sheer air beyond the walls. The effect is unnerving. Your modern instincts look for safety features, rails, walls, perhaps even a friendly reminder sign. But here, there's only the draft, the hollow sound of wind rushing below, and the unnerving knowledge that your weight is balanced above a vertical chute that feels only partly secure. You picture the wooden board bending slightly under the strain, its surface worn smooth from years of use. If you're unlucky, it's slick with condensation or ice. That board, though, is the throne of the castle, a mainstream historical fact. Archaeologists have uncovered garderobes in Norman and Plantagenet castles where the wooden seat simply rested on a stone slab with one or two holes carved into it. Some were single-seaters, but others contained multiple holes, placed side by side like the world's most awkward communal bench. Imagine being forced to sit elbow to elbow with another noble, while icy drafts blew up from below. Privacy, as we conceive of it, wasn't the top priority. Waste removal was. Lowering yourself onto such a contraption in winter feels less like relief and more like a dare. The moment you sit, the chill seeps into your thighs. The cold air streaming up from the shaft stings like needles, as if the moat itself were trying to freeze you from below. It's impossible not to shiver. You shift and wiggle, hoping friction might generate some tiny spark of warmth, but it doesn't. Instead, the board creaks under your movement, and for one dreadful second, you imagine it snapping. This thought isn't entirely paranoia. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval chronicles and letters occasionally mention accidents involving garderobes, from boards breaking to entire little projections, collapsing under weight and weather. One infamous account tells of a king's relative who fell to his death through a privy floor, crashing into the waste below. True or exaggerated, the story captures the very real fear that the thin support beneath you could betray you at any moment. And then there's the sound. As you sit, you can hear the echoing drop of water far below, sometimes the faint slap of the moat or ditch catching its latest contribution. The shaft is a resonant chamber, amplifying every movement, every sigh. If you dare to glance downward, though most people didn't, you'd see only darkness. Maybe a pale rim of snow clinging to the outer stone where the chute empties. It feels like staring into the abyss, only colder and smellier. Scholars still debate whether nobles of the highest rank had padded seats for winter. Some argue that fine furs or felt might have been laid across the wooden boards, if only for the lord's personal garderobe. Others insist that even kings suffered the same numb thighs as everyone else, because adding extra material would risk dampness and filth clinging to it. Either way, you can imagine the relief of a cushioned layer, even if it lasted only a few uses before becoming intolerably rank. The architecture itself reveals much about priorities. By situating garderobes along the outer walls, builders created a natural waste chute that emptied into the moat, ditch, or open air. In theory, this kept the smell away from the inner chambers. In practice, it just made the moat smell worse. You picture yourself stepping outside on a frosty morning, the moat frozen into a crusty sheet, with dark shapes trapped beneath the ice. A grotesque mosaic of castle life suspended in winter. But let's linger in the chamber itself. The stone walls are bare, perhaps scratched with graffiti left by bored squires or weary guards. You run your fingers along the grooves, seeing initials or crude symbols etched into the rock. Imagine passing time on this icy seat by carving a message for future visitors, a medieval version of bathroom stall chatter. Your breath fogs in the air, rising in little clouds. The slit window lets in a blade of moonlight, silver against the frost. Every sound outside feels immediate, hooves clopping in the courtyard, a dog barking, the muffled thud of someone chopping firewood. The garderobe, for all its indignity, connects you directly to the rhythms of the castle. You are perched at its edge, literally. There's another angle to consider: fear of what might come up the chute. Rats, always opportunists, found these shafts convenient highways. In summer, they climbed them easily, but in winter, they sometimes froze mid-journey, leaving little corpses half stuck in the stone. People whispered about other creatures too, spirits lurking in the dark void, demons rising with the draught. A whispered prayer or protective charm murmured under your breath wasn't unusual, especially when the seat was icy and the shadows long. Still, you can't avoid it. Everyone must use the toilet, from the lowest scullion to the lord of the keep. That shared necessity created a strange kind of equality, even if the facilities varied in size and placement. Tonight, you're experiencing the standard model: a simple board, an open shaft, and the cruel kiss of winter air. And yet, there's a strange intimacy to it. You sit, shivering, staring at the stones across from you, realizing that generations have endured the same. Lords planning wars, ladies in heavy gowns, servants rushing between chores, they all sat here, pulling their cloaks close, hoping the board would hold. The chamber itself becomes a time capsule of human need, stripped of ceremony. You rise, legs stiff from cold. You tug your garments back into place, stamping your feet against the flagstones to bring back circulation. The chill clings to you like a ghost, following you back into the hallway. The torchlight flickers, throwing your shadow long across the wall. You think of the shaft you just left behind, its endless drop, its hollow sounds, and you realize how much of castle life balanced on such precarious boards, suspended over voids of waste and ice. The seat over nothingness is more than a toilet. It's a reminder of fragility in a world of stone. Castles might look mighty, their walls defiant against time and weather, but even here, in these private recesses, life was delicate, uncomfortable, and sometimes laughably human. And as you shuffle away, cloak dragging behind you, the sound of the wind through the garderobe tower follows you down the hall, like a cold whisper reminding you that winter never leaves, not even in the most private of moments. You tug the cloak tighter around your body as you walk along the icy corridor again, but the memory of that wooden board above the void lingers. What strikes you most is the relentless cold. It's not just the sensation of icy stone underfoot or the frost-laced air in the garderobe. It's the way the cold seems alive, sneaking in from below, rising up through the chute like some mischievous sprite intent on nipping at your skin. You've never felt a breeze so personal, so direct, as the one that comes roaring up from the open shaft. Castle garderobes were, by design, open-ended. Waste dropped down into a pit, a moat, or the bare earth beyond the wall. This meant that in winter, when the outside air grew sharp and merciless, the shaft became a funnel sucking the cold inward. You lower yourself onto the seat again carefully. Hesitantly and immediately the chill rises, kissing your thighs and belly with the intimacy of frost itself. Your breath catches, and for a moment you wonder if you might leap up out of sheer shock. Here's a mainstream fact. Medieval builders often angled the garderobe shafts slightly outward so that waste would fall directly into running water or at least away from the walls. But this clever design also meant that the chute acted like a chimney in reverse, drawing air inside. On summer days, that airflow was a blessing, carrying odors outward. On winter nights, it was a curse. You're essentially sitting on top of a windpipe that has chosen the worst possible moment to exhale. You shift on the board, trying to find a position that spares you from the icy blast. It's impossible. The shaft is wide enough that the air finds its way around you no matter how you perch. The sensation is so intrusive that you can't help but mutter under your breath. Your words echo faintly down the chute, as though mocking you from below. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some households tried to soften this experience by draping cloth around the seat or even hanging animal skins over the opening when the garderobe wasn't in use. It worked like a primitive plug, though servants hated dealing with the damp, fouled cloth afterward. There's even mention of wool being stuffed down temporarily to block the draft, though that came with the risk of clogging the chute. You imagine a weary servant in midwinter, prying frozen lumps of wool from the shaft with numb fingers, silently cursing the lord who demanded it. But the draft wasn't just uncomfortable, it inspired fear. People in the Middle Ages firmly believed in miasma theory, the idea that bad air carried illness. A sudden gust of cold air rising from the garderobe wasn't just unpleasant, it was thought to be dangerous. Many believed the chill could settle into your bones, bringing fevers or worse. Scholars still debate whether those fears of night air were exaggerated superstition or a dim awareness of germs, but to you, perched and shivering, the fear feels utterly believable. You can almost sense the cold trying to worm its way deeper into your chest. The wind whistles and moans up the shaft, and you can't help but listen. It almost sounds like voices. Perhaps you hear a long sigh, a whistle like a far-off cry. It's eerie, and in the half-dark, with only a flickering candle for company, your imagination fills in the blanks. Was that the howl of winter, or the groan of some spirit dwelling in the depths? People whispered about demons climbing through privies, mischief-loving imps that rode the drafts. A little prayer murmured here wouldn't be out of place. You remember too that you are exposed, not just to the cold but to sound. Every shift of your body, every clearing of your throat, travels downward. In the courtyard or moat below, someone might hear the echoes. It's not exactly dignified, but then again, dignity takes a back seat when the air is freezing your very skin. Imagine now that it's the dead of night. The corridors are dark, torches guttering low. You creep from your bedchamber, the stone biting into your bare feet, your cloak clutched tight. Every step makes you question the decision. You reach the garderobe and lower yourself, only to be greeted with that rush of icy wind. Your teeth chatter as you try to finish quickly, all the while wondering how anyone survived winters like this. And here's a historical whisper that's both fascinating and dreadful. Some chronicles suggest people timed their bathroom visits strategically, holding off until midday when the sun might warm the air just enough to make the experience bearable. Nighttime trips were avoided if possible. Instead, chamber pots were used indoors, even if it meant waking a servant to empty them later. The drafty garderobe was simply too punishing. But sometimes there was no choice. The chamber pot was full, or the need too urgent. You had to face the shaft. And so you sat as you do now, feeling the cold air crawl across your body, numbing, biting, relentless. It turns an ordinary act into an ordeal. You count the seconds, willing your body to hurry. You think of the fire in the great hall, the blankets on your bed, the comfort that waits if you can just endure. You rise quickly, tugging your garments back in place. Your legs tremble with cold. You stamp your feet and rub your arms, but the chill clings, almost like a possession. You hurry back into the corridor, eager for warmth. Behind you, the garderobe sits silent, the draft still blowing, as eternal and merciless as the winter itself. You start to notice the irony. The castle, a fortress of strength, could not protect its people from the simplest torment. The wind outside was also the wind inside. The walls that kept enemies at bay let the cold seep in freely, funneled through the very systems meant to carry waste away. The grandeur of banners and battlements meant little when your most private moments were spent shivering over an open shaft. You pause, pressing your hands to the stone, feeling its icy surface. You realize this was the reality for everyone, lords, ladies, and servants alike. The garderobe draft was the great equalizer. It didn't matter if you wore silk or sackcloth, the cold found you all the same. And as you shuffle back toward the faint glow of firelight, you know that the story of castle life is incomplete without this detail. Yes, There were feasts and hunts, dances and tournaments. But there was also this: the midnight walk, the icy seat, the cruel wind rising from below. Without it, you'd miss the raw humanity of the Middle Ages, the truth hidden behind stone walls and romantic myths. The draft was not just a feature, it was a daily, nightly, lifelong companion, one that shaped habits, inspired fears, and left every castle dweller with memories they would rather not describe but never truly forget. You wrap your cloak more tightly, but no matter how snug you try to make it, the cold in these stone corridors seems to slip through every fold. The castle doesn't offer much comfort, not when the winds bite from every angle, and especially not when nature calls. You've seen the drafty garderobes, you've perched on the hard boards, you've heard the eerie whistle of air rushing up the shaft. But one truth about medieval winters stands clear. Nobody was foolish enough to face that ordeal without preparing first. And the key to preparation was layers upon layers of wool. You can picture it now, as you tug at the coarse cloth wrapped around your own body. In the Middle Ages, wool was the universal fabric. It was plentiful, warm, and surprisingly versatile. Your undertunic is made of a softer, finer weave, though it still feels scratchy compared to modern comforts. Over it hangs a heavier tunic, maybe dyed in subdued earth tones, and above that, a thick cloak clasped at the shoulder with a pin. Some wore hoods, others wrapped themselves in mantles lined with sheepskin. A mainstream historical fact: inventories from noble households often list dozens of woolen garments, layered not for fashion but for survival. Castles were cold in every season, but in winter they became icy caverns, and clothing was the only real insulation. You adjust the folds of your cloak before braving another visit to the garderobe. The goal is simple: minimize the amount of skin exposed to the cold, and do it quickly. It isn't easy. Heavy skirts or long tunics have to be lifted, thick hose tugged down, bulky layers arranged just so, and all while your hands are stiff with frost. Even nobles with attendants found the process tiresome. For the poor servant, already numbed from hauling firewood or buckets of water, it was simply another daily misery. And yet, out of this misery comes a quirky tidbit. Some sources hint that extra long shirts, which doubled as nightwear, were occasionally used as makeshift shields against the cold. A person might pull the hem of the shirt forward and sit on it, creating a thin but vital barrier between their skin and the icy wooden seat. It wasn't elegant, and certainly not hygienic, but when the draft blew like a winter storm from below, any trick to ease the shock was welcome. You lower yourself once more, adjusting your garments awkwardly. The cold strikes, but this time you feel at least partially shielded. The wool around your thighs dulls the sting. Still, the air finds its way through gaps and folds, wrapping around your legs like icy fingers. Your body trembles, and your teeth chatter, but you endure it. That's what winter in a castle demanded: endurance. It's worth pausing here to imagine the contrast. In the great hall, fires roar in massive hearths, and nobles gather close, drinking hot ale and listening to minstrels. The warmth there is almost intoxicating. You might even grow bold, shedding a layer, loosening a cloak, but the moment you step away, down the corridor to the garderobe, you re-enter the world of freezing stone. The difference is so jarring it feels almost cruel, as though the castle itself were mocking your need for relief. Historians still argue whether nobles had portable heated stones or braziers carried with them for such nighttime trips. Some suggest that a trusted servant might warm a stone and wrap it in cloth for the lord's hands, while others dismiss it as romantic invention. What is certain is that the garderobe itself was never warmed. No fire was wasted on a toilet chamber. The stones there remained bitterly cold, the draughts merciless, the seats rimed with frost. You can't help but imagine yourself layering more and more garments in preparation. Woolen hose pulled up to the thigh, thick tunics over thin ones, a hood wrapped tightly, leaving only your nose exposed, perhaps even mittens stitched from scraps of fur, though clumsy to handle in such tight quarters. Every layer is a defense, a fragile bulwark against the cold air waiting in that chamber. And yet, the more layers you wear, the more awkward the task becomes. You picture yourself fumbling in the half-light, cloak slipping, skirts tangled, hands stiff with cold, trying to rearrange everything quickly enough to avoid frostbite. You mutter under your breath, half curse, half prayer, hoping the ordeal ends soon. There is another detail worth noting. Chambermaids and laundry workers dreaded winter with particular passion. Wool garments trapped odors, and the garderobe experience only made it worse. A tunic worn for weeks absorbed more than just the scent of smoke and sweat. Washing was rare, so the smell clung, an unavoidable reminder of the coldest months. Imagine the rank odor of garments dried stiff by frost, hung in drafty rooms, never quite fresh. You finish your business quickly, adjusting your layers with a sigh. The air still burns against your cheeks, your hands ache with cold, but at least your body is covered again. You shuffle back toward the corridor, stamping your feet to bring warmth into your toes. Each layer of wool suddenly feels heavier, damper, as if it has absorbed the cold and now carries it with you. Still, there's a certain comfort in the ritual. You know that everyone in the castle shares this misery. Lords, ladies, children, servants, all bundling in layers, all muttering as they face the draft. The layers create a kind of uniformity, a shared strategy for survival. They remind you that beneath the pomp of banners and the clang of armor, the human body is fragile, always vulnerable to the simplest elements. And as you settle by the fire again, pulling your cloak close, you realize how precious that warmth feels. The flicker of flames, the faint crackle of wood, the glow on your face, it's enough to make you drowsy, even after the shock of the garderobe. But in the back of your mind, you know you'll have to rise again, later in the night, and once more face the cold air waiting in the dark. For now, though, you savor the heat, imagining wool layered upon wool, the only armor against the bitter breath of winter sneaking upward from the depths of the castle walls. You wander farther into the castle's sleeping quarters, where narrow wooden doors open into chambers used not just for rest, but also, in their own way, for necessity. The garderobe is one thing, an icy box perched above a chute, but castles also had another option for those unwilling to brave the drafts. Tonight, you're about to discover the curious, sometimes uncomfortable truth of the multi-seat toilets, where privacy gave way to practicality, and the cold season turned the experience into an even stranger ordeal. Step into a slightly larger room now, and instead of one lonely board, you see a long wooden bench stretching across the wall. Several neat round holes have been cut into it, side by side. The room might hold 3 or 4 people at once, sometimes even more in the biggest castles. Imagine sliding onto a spot while someone else sits only a couple of feet away, both of you shivering, cloaks pulled tight, trying to avoid eye contact. The design wasn't about comfort, it was about efficiency. One notable detail from castle records tells us that in places like Dover or Rochester, multiple garderobes were built in a row to serve groups quickly, especially garrisons of soldiers. Castles housed dozens, even hundreds of people, and winter didn't lessen the need. Now picture this setting in the dead of January. The cold presses in from all sides. Each seat funnels its own icy draft from below, and the combined effect turns the room into a chamber of swirling air currents. You shift on the bench, tugging your garments into place, while another figure clears their throat nervously. The silence is unbearable, broken only by the moan of wind and the occasional cough. It might surprise you, but there's a curious report from travelers who noted that such shared spaces sometimes became sites for quick conversation. Gossip, complaints about food, even muttered prayers, people couldn't help but talk. In fact, one odd little note from a monastic chronicle describes novices in a monastery using the shared latrine as a chance to whisper forbidden jokes, shielded by the general embarrassment of the setting. The same could easily have been true in castles. Where else could 2 people speak without anyone lingering long enough to overhear? Yet not everyone saw these multi-seat rooms as harmless. The arrangement raised questions then as it does now. Did nobles truly sit elbow to elbow with servants? Or were there separate spaces for rank? Surviving architecture hints at both grander garderobes attached to private chambers and communal benches tucked into less refined areas. Some researchers suggest that high-born lords avoided the multi-seat experience whenever possible, while soldiers and lower retainers had little choice. But the fact that both types of rooms existed shows that toilet life was more varied than romantic myths ever reveal. And let's not pretend these spaces were clean. With several people using the bench at once, spills were inevitable. Waste could splash, drafts could scatter odors unpredictably, and more than one medieval complaint describes the stench clinging stubbornly even in cold air. Imagine the discomfort of sitting there with frost forming on the seat while the sour smell still drifted around, only slightly muted by the chill. You'd wish for quick relief, not conversation. Still, there's something almost comical about it. Picture two armored men, swords at their sides, shifting uncomfortably on the bench as they discuss the day's patrols. Their voices echo off stone, their breath fogs in the air, and beneath them the shaft swallows every sound with equal indifference. It's a reminder that castles, for all their grandeur, were also places where human needs stripped away status. Some aspects remain uncertain, and academics haven't reached full agreement. Did these shared garderobes really foster camaraderie, or did people avoid them as much as possible? It's hard to know, because while the structures survive, the etiquette doesn't. Perhaps in the coldest winters, necessity forced people together, bundled in wool, muttering quietly while enduring the blast of air from below. Or perhaps the communal benches were dreaded, used only when chamber pots or private garderobes were unavailable. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. You rise from the bench, stamping your feet to shake off the cold. Your imagination lingers on the awkwardness of such gatherings. Shared laughter, maybe, or tense silence broken only by wind. Either way, the communal garderobe was a fixture of castle life, especially in places where soldiers outnumbered nobles. And as you slip back into the corridor, you realize that even here, in a fortress built for defense and ceremony, the most basic acts of life were colored by shared humanity, tinged with embarrassment, and wrapped in the unrelenting cold of winter. The night grows darker as you leave the echoing bench of the communal garderobe behind. Torches spit and hiss along the walls, their flames weak against the chill. You rub your hands together, but the warmth fades as soon as you step away from the firelit spaces. You know the truth by now. Every trip to the garderobe is a battle with the cold. But the people of medieval castles were not fools. They invented ways to avoid those bitter walks altogether, and in winter their most trusted allies were the humble chamber pots kept close at hand. Step into a bedchamber now. The stone walls are still cold, but here at least there are rugs scattered on the floor, heavy curtains drawn across arrow slits, and a brazier glowing faintly in the corner. A great bed dominates the room, its frame massive, hung with thick drapes to hold in warmth. Near the foot of the bed, tucked discreetly under a stool, rests a pot, usually ceramic, sometimes metal, occasionally even wood lined with lead. This was the medieval shortcut. When the urge struck in the middle of the night, you reached for the pot instead of trudging through icy corridors to the garderobe tower. One well-documented feature of noble life was the ubiquity of chamber pots. Household inventories from castles and manor houses list them by the dozen, proof that everyone from lords to ladies to visiting guests relied on them. Servants too kept smaller pots by their pallets in the kitchens or dormitories, because no one wanted to face the midnight cold if it could be avoided. You picture yourself in such a bed. You've wrapped yourself in blankets, maybe even stuffed a warmed stone into the sheets. The room is dark, except for the faint glow of embers. The thought of leaving this little pocket of warmth is unbearable. So, when your body insists, you simply reach down, tug the pot into position, and take care of business without ever stepping onto the frozen floor. It's not glamorous, but it is survival. And here comes a curious observation. People often shared chamber pots in households where servants slept in groups. In fact, a large pot might be placed in the corner of a dormitory, and each person would use it in turn. It wasn't elegant, and it certainly wasn't fragrant, but it kept everyone indoors. Imagine the muffled groans, the whispered apologies, the hasty movements under blankets. The sound of liquid hitting ceramic in the dead of night would have been as common in a castle as the creak of beams in the wind. Of course, someone had to empty the pots in the morning. That task fell to the lowest-ranking servants, who trudged through the cold with sloshing vessels of half-frozen waste, trying not to spill on themselves as they dumped the contents into larger pits or directly into the moat. One chronicler mentions how these servants were mocked for their smell, nicknamed dirty hands, or worse. You can almost feel their misery, numb fingers gripping handles, faces twisted in disgust, breath clouding in the frosty air. There's an odd little note that sometimes, in especially cold weather, the contents of the pot would freeze solid before morning. Servants then had to shake the lump out like a stubborn jelly, banging the pot against the ground to free it. The thought makes you grimace and laugh at once. What an image! Frozen waste clattering out onto the snow, steam rising faintly in the pale dawn. Not all chamber pots were plain. Nobles often had decorated ones, glazed with bright colours or painted with patterns. Some were even inscribed with mocking phrases. Imagine using a pot that sneered at your expense every time you looked down at it. Archaeologists have uncovered pots with faces at the bottom, so that you'd be aiming directly at a caricature. It was humour in a world that otherwise offered little comfort in this department. But while the chamber pot spared you the walk, it brought other worries. In small rooms, the smell lingered. Even if the pot was covered with a wooden lid, the odour seeped out. Curtains around the bed helped trap warmth, but they also trapped stink. You imagine lying under blankets, half asleep, nose wrinkling, wondering if enduring the drafty garderobe might have been worth it after all. Experts still puzzle over how common chamber pots were in the grandest settings. Some argue they were universal, even in palaces, while others suggest that nobles clung to their private garderobes and left pots to servants. The truth is hard to pin down, but the surviving evidence points toward practicality winning over pride. In winter, everyone wanted a pot close by. So you crouch by the bed, lifting the heavy pot in your hands. Its surface is cold, almost painfully so, and you shiver as you set it back down. You pull the blankets tighter, grateful that this option exists, even if it's less than dignified. The chamber pot was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a lifeline in the bleakest months. As dawn begins to edge across the horizon, you hear the shuffle of servants' feet, the clatter of pots being collected, the muttered curses of those tasked with the morning's foulest chore. You close your eyes, sinking back into the warmth of your blankets, and you can almost forget the drafty garderobe tower for a little while longer. But the castle outside still breathes frost. The cold waits in the corridors, and sooner or later you'll have to face it again. The chamber pot is only a temporary escape. The morning light seeps through narrow arrow slits, pale and weak, barely enough to chase away the chill. You shuffle out of the bedchamber, careful not to kick the chamber pot tucked near the stool. The room is warmer than the corridor, but it still holds a faint sour tang. The reason is obvious. Pots may have spared you the midnight walk, but someone must deal with them at dawn. Step now into the courtyard, where servants move about with buckets and jugs, their breath puffing in the frigid air. Among them are those burdened with the least envied duty, emptying the chamber pots. You see them trudging along, each carrying a sloshing vessel, faces twisted in distaste. Their boots slip on patches of ice as they make their way toward the moat or refuse pits. The sound is unmistakable, liquid slopping against ceramic, mixed with muffled curses. From castle account rolls, we know that this was often assigned to lower servants or young boys, sometimes even women who worked in laundries. These workers were called by many names, but none flattering. One account from 14th century England records payments to gong scourers, tasked with clearing not just pots but also the deeper cesspits. The word gong meant dung, and scourer meant cleaner, a title that summed up their life's work in two sharp syllables. As you watch, you notice the frozen edges on the pots. The waste inside has stiffened during the night, turning into strange half-solid lumps that clink against the sides. One servant bangs a pot against the ground to shake free a stubborn block, grimacing as the sound echoes through the courtyard. It's both absurd and pitiful, and you can't help but smile grimly at the thought of this bizarre winter ritual. And then, the disposal itself. Some servants tip their loads directly into the moat, the contents splattering against the icy surface before seeping into cracks. Others dump the frozen lumps onto refuse heaps, where they steam faintly in the morning air. Dogs sniff curiously, then recoil. The stench, muted by frost, still clings to everything. Archaeological digs around castle moats often reveal layers of organic waste, proof of centuries of this practice. It wasn't just human waste either. Kitchen scraps, bones, broken pottery, all tossed together. In winter, the mix froze into grotesque sculptures of daily life. You imagine leaning over the parapet, looking down at a frozen sheet dotted with strange shapes, each one a testament to last night's meals and necessities. But while the moat served as a dumping ground, it also posed problems. Water supplies could be contaminated. Rats thrived in the mix. Historians note that outbreaks of illness often followed winters when waste disposal was especially careless. Some researchers argue that freezing may have slowed the spread of disease, but others caution that thaw in spring released all the filth at once. The debate lingers, unresolved, much like the smell itself. For the servants, though, such worries were secondary. Their task was immediate: carry the pots, empty them, clean them, and return them before the lord or lady stirred fully awake. To neglect the duty was unthinkable. Imagine the shame of a noble finding their chamber pot still full, the reprimand that would follow, the punishment perhaps harsher than the stench itself. One curious record mentions that some households sprinkled herbs into pots before they were carried out: lavender, mint, or rosemary. This made the chore slightly less unbearable for both servant and master. You picture a boy scattering dried mint leaves over the pot before lifting it, breathing deeply as though the faint aroma might mask the truth. And yet, even with herbs, the odor lingered. Walk through the castle corridors in the morning, and you'd often catch whiffs of it. Sour, pungent, earthy. The stone walls held smells stubbornly. Rushes on the floor absorbed them. Even tapestries couldn't fully disguise them. In winter, when windows stayed shut against the cold, the atmosphere grew heavy, a mix of smoke from the hearth and human waste carried in passing buckets. Now place yourself in the shoes of one of those servants. Your hands are numb, your boots soaked from sloshing ice, your stomach queasy from the smell. You mutter under your breath, curse the cold, curse the pots, curse the very stones of the castle. But you keep walking, because duty demands it. You tip the pot, shake it, wipe it, and carry it back again. The rhythm of your life is tied to the bowels of others. And then consider the strange intimacy of it. A servant might know the habits of their master better than anyone, how often they used the pot, what they ate, even their health, judged by colour and consistency. It was knowledge both unwanted and unavoidable. In a world obsessed with hierarchy and dignity, the chamber pot cut through pretense with ruthless clarity. You return now to the bedchamber where the fire has been coaxed back to life. The pot rests clean, a little damp from rinsing, but ready for the next long winter's night. You glance at it with a mix of gratitude and distaste. Without it, you'd be shivering in the garderobe tower. With it, you're spared the draught but reminded each morning of the labour it demands from others. And so the chamber pot, humble and foul, becomes another lens through which to view castle life. Not just the lords at their feasts, but the servants in the cold dawn, banging frozen lumps against the ground and muttering curses into the frosty air. The dawn settles into a brittle winter morning, frost glittering across the courtyard stones, every sound carrying sharp and clear in the thin air. By now you've seen chamber pots hauled, shaken, dumped, and rinsed. You felt the cold drafts of garderobes and the numb weight of woolen layers. But today, you're confronted with one of the strangest and perhaps most unspoken truths of castle life in deep winter. Sometimes the waste itself froze solid. Imagine crouching over a chamber pot in the middle of the night, your breath fogging so thick it seems like smoke. You finish your business, slide the pot back beneath the bed, and fall into uneasy sleep. By the time morning comes, the liquid has stiffened into a pale, glistening slab. The surface looks like glass, with faint cracks running across it. Touch it with a finger, and it's hard as stone. In the coldest winters, this was no rare occurrence, it was normal. One particularly telling account comes from the 15th century, describing a January so cold that entire cesspits froze, their contents hardening into immovable blocks. Workers couldn't dig them out until the thaw. For weeks, the garderobes were nearly unusable, with shafts clogged by layers of ice and filth. You can almost hear the complaints echoing through the corridors, muffled curses from nobles, louder ones from servants who had to chip away with picks. It's grim, yes, but oddly fascinating. Frozen waste had its peculiar advantages. The smell dulled almost completely. The acrid bite of ammonia, usually so sharp, was muted under layers of frost. Servants carrying frozen blocks found the job less nauseating, though no less humiliating. You can imagine one trudging across the courtyard, bucket in hand, chunks rattling like stones, his breath puffing white. There's even a curious record from a German castle, where children apparently used frozen lumps as projectiles, hurling them across icy yards in fits of laughter. It sounds like grotesque mischief, but in a world with few toys and endless winter, what else could you expect? That image, youngsters cackling as they fling hardened filth, captures the raw strangeness of medieval life better than any painting of knights in shining armor. Still, freezing created problems. Garderobe shafts, designed to channel waste away, could become clogged. Imagine a chute narrowed by layers of frost, the flow halted, the draft replaced by a foul blockage. Workers had to descend with iron tools, hacking at the icy buildup, shivering as splinters flew. The danger was real. Slips, falls, even suffocation in confined spaces. Records of gong scarers mention accidents that cut lives short. You picture them bundled in wool, faces wrapped in cloth against the stench, chipping away with crude picks until sweat dripped and froze on their brows. Some historians suggest that castles planned for this, building multiple garderobes so that when one froze, others could still be used. Others argue that people simply endured, turning more heavily to chamber pots until the thaw came. Either way, winter transformed waste management from a daily burden into a battle against nature itself. But the frozen waste told stories too. Archaeologists today study cesspits from castles, finding preserved seeds, bones, and even parasites inside. The freezing winters helped preserve these layers, turning them into time capsules. From them we learn what people ate: barley, beans, pork bones, and what diseases plagued them. It's odd to think that the cold miseries of medieval life have become the clues through which we piece their world back together. Back in your imagined castle, you watch a servant struggling with a blocked chute. He bangs at the ice, muttering while the noble household grows impatient. The great hall echoes with complaints. The garderobe is unusable. The smell is worse. The servant's too slow. Nobody thanks him when he finally clears the way, soaked with sweat that chills instantly on his skin. He goes back to his corner, exhausted, only to face the same task again tomorrow. And then there's the psychological toll. Imagine lowering yourself onto a seat rimmed with ice. The shock would be unbearable. The wood so cold it seemed to burn. People wrapped themselves in extra wool, tried to hover instead of sitting fully, or simply avoided the garderobe altogether. In some winters, avoidance became impossible, and misery ruled. Not every story is bleak, though. One traveller's note from Burgundy hints that frozen waste was sometimes seen as proof of divine judgment. God himself has turned the foulness of man into stone. The remark drips with irony but also reveals the medieval mindset interpreting even bodily functions through the lens of faith. Scholars remain divided on how much freezing actually helped sanitation. Some argue it slowed rot, lessening disease in cold months. Others caution that when spring thaw arrived, the sudden release of filth spread illness more swiftly. The truth is likely complicated, as survival often is. For you, sitting in this castle, the reality is simpler. Each winter night brings the same dread, the same frozen outcome, the same clumsy ritual of dumping blocks into the moat. Picture yourself now standing on the battlements, looking down at the frozen moat. The ice is thick, but dark shapes lie trapped beneath. Some are animal bones, some kitchen scraps, and some, inevitably, human leavings. The sight is grotesque yet strangely mesmerizing, an accidental museum of castle life, preserved until spring frees it. You pull your cloak tighter and step back inside. The warmth of the hall greets you, the smell of roasting meat replacing the faint stench from outside. You sit near the fire, listening to minstrels, trying to forget the images of frozen blocks and clogged chutes. But you know you'll remember. Because for all the grandeur of castle life, for every story of nights and feasts, there was always this other story too, the story of frozen necessity, endured in silence, shaping daily life as surely as swords or banners ever did. The fire in the great hall crackles and pops, logs spitting as they burn, and for a moment you feel as though the world outside has softened. But when you step away, crossing the drafty corridor, the air grows sharp again, biting your cheeks, creeping into your bones. You're heading toward another garderobe, and as you push open its wooden door, a realization dawns. The cold has one strange mercy. It changes the smell. Step inside, and you expect the usual sour punch to the nose, that mixture of ammonia and damp stone. Instead, you find something else muted, dulled, almost muffled by the frost. The stench is still there, but winter has numbed it, just as it numbs your fingers. It's as if the very air has frozen the odors mid-breath, trapping them before they can fully unfurl. We know from written observations that people notice this difference. One cleric's journal from the 13th century even praises God for the clean scent of winter garderobes, a phrase that would make you chuckle if your teeth weren't already chattering. That line reveals a basic truth. The cold was both enemy and ally. It froze your skin, stiffened your joints, and sent icy drafts up through the seat, but at least it dulled the stink. You settle onto the board, cloak wrapped tightly, and you breathe cautiously through your nose. The air smells faintly earthy, perhaps even mineral, more like wet stone than foulness. It's not pleasant, but it's bearable. The relief is temporary, though, because the cold that spares your nose attacks the rest of your body without mercy. Here's a curious note from castle life. Herbs and rushes were often scattered across floors to fight odors. In garderobes, sprigs of juniper, rosemary, or thyme might be left on shelves or stuffed into cracks. The cold made them last longer, their fragrance sharper against the muted smells. Picture a weary servant tossing handfuls of herbs into a shaft, muttering that the rosemary worked better than prayer. The scent lingers faintly even now, mixing with the frost, a ghost of summer in the heart of winter. But don't let the herbs and frost fool you. The smell never vanished completely. The cold slowed decay but didn't erase it. Sometimes the odor clung even more stubbornly to garments, because wool absorbed scents like a sponge. Servants complained of laundry that never smelled fresh, even after rinsing. You can imagine a cloak stiff with frost, reeking faintly of smoke and waste, no matter how many times it was shaken out. And here comes the irony. While winter spared the nose in some ways, it also trapped people indoors for longer periods. The result? More chamber pots filled, more waste waiting to be carried out, more chances for smells to accumulate in hallways and stairwells. The stench didn't float as freely through the air, but it concentrated in pockets, clinging to fabrics and hiding in corners. Step past a tapestry, and you might catch an unpleasant whiff frozen into its folds. Some researchers argue that medieval people were so accustomed to smells that they hardly noticed them. Others insist that complaints in chronicles about foul air, noxious vapours, and the like prove that odours were as offensive then as now. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. Perhaps you, living in the castle, would wrinkle your nose but carry on, the smell becoming part of daily life. Still, you'd remember the rare moment when frost dulled the stench enough to make a garderobe feel almost tolerable. Yet tolerable doesn't mean pleasant. Imagine sitting in silence, every sound amplified by stone, the drip of water, the whistle of wind, the shuffle of rats somewhere below. You inhale cautiously, grateful that your nose isn't assaulted, but the air is so cold that each breath cuts like glass. You pull your cloak tighter, shifting your feet against the icy floor, and you wonder how much longer you can endure. There's a strange sort of comedy in it. You've traded one misery for another. Less smell, more cold. You find yourself thinking fondly of summer, when at least the draught warmed your skin, even if it carried foulness with it. You chuckle quietly, then clamp your mouth shut, because laughter makes you breathe deeper, and deeper breaths draw in more of the lingering odour. One odd custom noted in some households was the practice of burning incense before noble guests used a garderobe. Imagine a servant walking ahead with a small brazier, smoke wafting into the cold air, sweet spice battling the sharper stench. In winter, the incense smoke hung in the still, icy chamber like a frozen veil. You'd sit surrounded by it, half choked, half comforted, uncertain whether to thank or curse the effort. You rise quickly, pulling your garments back into place. The smell may have been softened, but the cold has sunk deep into your legs. As you step out into the corridor, the air outside feels almost warmer, though it's only a cruel trick of perception. You shake your head, realizing that every trip to the garderobe is a negotiation between discomforts. Better a dulled stench with freezing air, or a tolerable chill with suffocating odor. You know you'll never quite forget the peculiar smell of winter garderobes, a mix of frost, herbs, smoke, and something you'd rather not name. It's part of castle life, woven into the fabric of daily routine, endured by nobles and servants alike. Back in the hall, you sink onto a bench near the fire. Someone passes a mug of hot ale, and you lift it to your lips. The warmth spreads through your chest, chasing away the last icy breath of the garderobe. You close your eyes, savoring the moment, knowing it won't last. Soon enough, you'll have to face the cold again. But for now, the memory of muted smells and frosty air lingers, a strange kind of mercy hidden in the cruelty of winter. The warmth of the great hall is almost intoxicating. You sit close to the hearth, flames painting your cheeks red, and for a while you let yourself drift in comfort. The smell of roasting meat and spiced ale fills the air, mingling with the resinous smoke of burning logs. People talk, laugh, and even sing, and for a brief moment, you forget the cold. But then nature reminds you your body has its needs, and the thought creeps back. You will have to leave the fireside and walk once more to the freezing garderobe. This moment of contrast was at the core of medieval winter life. One reliable account from castle records describes how fires were kept burning around the clock in noble halls during the coldest months. But the warmth stopped at the hearth. The corridors beyond remained unheated stone tunnels. Imagine the dread of leaving your cozy bench, cloak heavy on your shoulders, only to step into air so cold it seared your lungs. The short journey to the toilet became a miniature exile, a journey from paradise into purgatory. The reality was even harsher for those who had no choice but to step outside the great hall regularly. Guards, servants, and cooks didn't sit by the fire all day. For them, the cold was constant. But for you, sitting here by the flames, the pain lies in the contrast, the sudden plunge from warmth into ice. There's an almost comical element to it. Picture yourself holding on as long as you can, sipping less ale, shifting uncomfortably, bargaining with your body just to avoid leaving the hearth. Maybe you whisper excuses to your companions, "I'll go later," or "I'm fine for now." But eventually inevitability wins. You rise reluctantly, shuffle toward the door, and the firelight falls away behind you. The corridor greets you with its familiar sigh of wind. Torches sputter in the draught, their light flickering. You pull your cloak close and walk, each step carrying you farther from warmth. The anticipation is almost worse than the act itself, knowing what waits, picturing the icy seat, the upward blast of air. The thought gnaws at you. Here's a small but telling detail. Some nobles had servants escort them with lanterns or even brazier pots to soften the journey. You can imagine a boy trudging alongside, the embers glowing faintly, though the heat hardly reaches more than a foot from the coals. By the time you reach the garderobe, your face is still numb, your hands stiff. The little brazier is more symbol than salvation. Now consider the psychological weight of leaving a cozy hearth. The fire was not just warmth, it was companionship, safety, even entertainment. It was the heart of castle life. To step away from it for a lonely, draughty chamber felt like punishment. No wonder so many people clung to chamber pots or delayed their needs until morning. And yet, some things couldn't be delayed. When the body demanded, you had no choice. So here you are again, pushing open the heavy wooden door, stepping into the cold chamber. The air greets you instantly, sharp and bitter. You lower yourself quickly, muttering under your breath, trying not to think of the fire you abandoned. The wind rushes up, the seat bites, and your mind drifts back longingly to the warmth of the hall. One unusual practice recorded in northern castles was the use of toilet cloaks, extra heavy mantles kept near the garderobe just for the trip. Servants would wrap one around their lord before the short journey. Imagine a noble, layered in fabric, still shivering as he perches on the board. The cloak offered some comfort, but the drafts paid no heed to status. Everyone endured the same icy assault. Researchers continue to debate whether garderobes were ever lined with insulating materials for winter, perhaps straw along the walls or furs on the seats. Some suggest they were, citing traces of organic material found in shafts. Others argue such comforts would have been too impractical, quickly fouled by moisture. Whatever the truth, the general picture remains. Most people faced the garderobe with only their regular garments, no matter how bitter the cold. Back in the great hall, the fire still roars. As you return, rubbing your hands, you realize how much sweeter the warmth feels after such a trial. You sit again on the bench, your cheeks tingling as sensation returns. The laughter and music seem louder, the food more delicious, the drink more soothing. The hearth doesn't just warm you, it restores your spirit. But the memory lingers. You know that warmth here comes at the cost of cold elsewhere. Each trip to the garderobe is a reminder of life's fragility, of the castle's inability to shield you from its own design. Fire cannot follow you down those corridors. The walls that guard against enemies offer no defense against drafts. And so you sit, savoring the fire, knowing you'll face the cold again, bargaining silently with your body to make it wait a little longer. The truth is simple, yet relentless. In a medieval castle during the coldest winters, the warmth of the hearth was always fleeting, always temporary, always surrendered to the freezing necessity of the garderobe. You step away from the fire again, though this time you linger at the threshold of the hall. Your nose is filled with the scent of pine logs and roasted meat, but something else creeps in as you move down the corridor, the faint, sharp odor of waste. Even in winter, when frost numbs the stench, the castle's air carries reminders of where hundreds of people relieve themselves. And as you draw closer to one of the smaller garderobes tucked against the wall, you notice something on the floor, a scattering of rushes and dried herbs. Floor coverings of this kind were a common attempt to combat smell. Instead of rugs or carpets, which were expensive and rare, castles often used rushes, reeds, or straw spread across the stone floors. Servants refreshed them now and then, adding aromatic plants like lavender, rosemary, and mint. Archaeological digs confirm this. Layers of old rushes still survive in castle debris, carrying traces of both perfume and filth. The idea was simple: trap the dirt, soak up the damp, and release a pleasant fragrance to balance the foul air. Imagine walking into this little chamber. The rushes crunch under your boots, brittle with frost at the edges. The herbs give off a faint fragrance when crushed, something sharp and green, almost medicinal. You lower yourself onto the seat, wrapping your cloak around you, and for a moment you feel tricked. The room smells faintly fresh, but the icy draft rising from below cuts through any illusion of comfort. One amusing glimpse into daily life comes from records of households ordering enormous quantities of herbs purely for this purpose. Lavender and mint were particularly popular. Imagine the absurdity. Fields of herbs grown not for medicine or cooking, but to sprinkle across toilet floors. It's a detail that brings a smile. You can almost picture the gardener's pride turning into a muttered complaint when yet another cartload of mint was sent straight into the garderobe. But the rushes did more than perfume. They also absorbed spills and waste. And here lies the darker truth. Those pretty herbs mixed with human dirt quickly. The scent masked the smell for a day or two, but soon the coverings reeked worse than the stone beneath. Chroniclers complained that castles often stank of rotting rushes, even in noble chambers. Imagine the garderobe, then, with layers of filth hidden beneath brittle stalks. The floor might look inviting, but one step too deep could sink your boot into something soft and unspeakable. And yet, the practice persisted. People clung to herbs and rushes as though they truly conquered the problem. It was part ritual, part hope. Sprinkle rosemary, scatter mint, and maybe, just maybe, the room will feel a little less unbearable. It speaks to a human truth. Even in misery, we reach for beauty. Not everyone agreed on their value, however. Some accounts praised the fresh scent of new rushes, others dismissed them as breeding grounds for vermin. Scholars remained divided. Did herbs meaningfully improve sanitation, or were they little more than medieval air fresheners? Whatever the verdict, you can almost smell the experiment as you sit here. Sharp rosemary battling ammonia, lavender faint against damp stone, mint crushed into something half pleasant, half rancid. You picture servants replacing the rushes, their hands red with cold. They carry baskets of straw and herbs, scattering them across the stone with practiced motions. They mutter as they work, the scent of rosemary clinging to their clothes, the task endless and thankless. By the next morning, the rushes will already be fouled, needing replacement once more. And think, too, of how these coverings connected to belief. Medieval people often associated scents with health. Good smells were thought to protect against disease, while foul odors carried sickness. So scattering herbs in the garderobe wasn't just about making it bearable, it was about survival. To breathe lavender was to breathe safety. To mask ammonia with mint was to guard against death. At least, that was the hope. You sit, cloak tight around your shoulders, feeling the herbs crunch beneath your boots. The smell is unusual, half garden, half cesspit. You wonder if you're truly safer or simply tricked by perfume. The draft from below continues its icy assault, indifferent to herbs, indifferent to faith. You hurry through your task, rise, and brush rushes from your shoes. When you leave the chamber, you glance back at the floor. The scatter of herbs looks almost decorative, like a careless attempt at beauty. But you know the truth. By nightfall, the fragrance will be gone, replaced by the same bitter stench. And tomorrow, the servants will bring more, starting the ritual again. The great hall greets you once more with warmth and the scent of meat. You sit, listening to laughter and music, but your mind lingers on the memory of mint crushed underfoot, lavender wilting in damp straw, and rosemary stubbornly releasing its scent against the tide of filth. You realize that castle life was never just about stone walls or armored knights. It was also about herbs scattered on toilet floors, tiny defenses against discomfort in a world where winter never let go. You've endured drafts that cut like knives, sat on boards that numbed your bones, and breathed through herbs scattered in a vain attempt to mask the stench. But now the question rises, what did people actually use to clean themselves once the deed was done? In the depths of winter, when snow clung to every battlement and ice rimed the moat, The answer was often as startling as it was practical. Toilet paper, as you know it, didn't exist in the medieval castle. Instead, people reached for whatever was available materials that were cheap, disposable, and close at hand. In warmer months, that might mean moss, straw, scraps of cloth, or even handfuls of grass. But in the coldest winters, snow itself became the unexpected ally. Imagine it. You've just lowered yourself onto the icy board, shivering as the draft rushes upward. You finish quickly, desperate to leave, but you still need to clean yourself. There is no neat roll of soft paper waiting. Instead, you scoop a fistful of fresh snow. The sensation is so shocking, so cold, that your body almost jerks upward. Your skin prickles with a sting sharper than the wind. Yet the snow does the job. It wipes, it cleans, and perhaps unexpectedly, it leaves a fleeting sense of freshness. One detail recorded in Scandinavian sources makes it clear that snow was commonly used in northern climates. It was abundant, after all, and unlike cloth, it didn't have to be washed. Some chroniclers even praised it as pure and God-given. You can almost laugh, imagining monks nodding solemnly as they pat themselves with handfuls of frost. It's practical, yes, but also absurdly comical when you picture it in the freezing silence of a castle garderobe. Of course, not everyone embraced the snowy solution. There were alternatives. Nobles might keep scraps of linen or wool for wiping, though these had to be washed afterward, an unpleasant job for laundresses in winter, who boiled buckets of water in icy courtyards while their fingers cracked from cold. Common folk often relied on handfuls of straw, stored in baskets near the garderobe. Picture a servant tossing down bundles of straw into the shaft for both wiping and helping waste slide downward. It was functional but splintery. You wouldn't envy the person forced to rely on it. A stranger custom, mentioned in some Mediterranean texts, involved using pieces of pottery known as pessoa. These flat shards were used like scrapers. Did northern castles adopt such practices? It's debated. Some argue that shards of broken pots found in cesspits were just rubbish, not hygiene tools. Others suggest they were indeed used for wiping, hard and uncomfortable as they seem. The truth is murky, but you can imagine the discomfort if they were. Snow suddenly feels like a blessing by comparison. There's even a curious reference in folklore that people believed snow had medicinal qualities, cooling inflammations, cleansing impurities. Perhaps that was just a way to rationalize the shock. You crouch in the garderobe now, snow packed in your hand, wincing at the sting but convincing yourself it's healthy. Humans, after all, will endure anything if they can spin a hopeful story around it. Still, hygiene practices varied wildly. Archaeological finds from castle latrines reveal cloth fragments, some of them clearly used. In wealthier households, rags might be set aside for this purpose, collected in baskets, and washed in rotation. Imagine the poor laundress, breaking ice on a bucket of water, scrubbing foul linen with ash soap, muttering at the indignity of noble habits. She would dry the rags on lines stretched in courtyards, where the winter wind whipped them stiff. For the lower ranks, the choices were cruder. Straw was cheap and plentiful. Moss, though less common in winter, might still be gathered and dried in advance. In desperate moments, bare hands were used, wiped on rushes or walls, then rinsed in whatever water could be found. It sounds shocking now, but in the urgency of a freezing night, practicality often outweighed propriety. Experts still disagree on just how common snow was as a medieval hygiene tool. Some argue it was a last resort, used only when other materials failed. Others believe it was widespread, especially in northern Europe, where snow lay thick for months at a time. The written evidence is scarce, but the logic is strong. When the world is covered in white, why not use it? You rise from the seat now, brushing at your cloak. Your hands tingle from the chill of snow. Your skin feels raw but oddly clean. You glance at the shaft below, where handfuls of straw and scraps of cloth lie frozen in layers, mixed with ice. The sight is unglamorous, but it tells a story of survival, of improvisation, of the lengths people went to manage daily life in bitter winters. When you step back into the corridor, the torchlight flickers on your face. You stamp your feet against the cold floor, pulling your cloak tighter, but your mind lingers on the experience. You realize that castle life wasn't only about grandeur or battles. It was about small choices made in the dark, whether to use straw or cloth, whether to brave the snow, whether to believe in its cleansing powers or curse its sting. You head back toward the hall, where laughter and warmth await. But you carry with you the memory of snow pressed to your skin, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even the coldest, harshest elements of nature were recruited into the most private corners of human survival. The hall is alive with chatter again, but your thoughts stray to the memory of snow clenched in your palm, the sting still fresh in your imagination. You find yourself glancing down the corridor, thinking about the next visit, wondering what new discomfort awaits, and soon enough, you discover it. As you shuffle once more into a garderobe perched against the outer wall, you're struck by a sight that makes you pause. The wooden seat itself is glazed with a thin sheen of frost, sparkling in the faint torchlight like crystal. It is one thing to sit on a cold board. It is quite another to place yourself on a rim of ice. Lower yourself too quickly, and your skin sticks. Sit too long, and you feel as though the seat itself has fused to you. The cold is so sharp it burns, the kind of pain that makes you clench your jaw and fight back a gasp. You shift, you squirm, you even hover slightly, but there's no escaping the icy bite. One firmly recorded detail from chronicles of northern castles is that frost often crept into garderobes during the harshest winters. These chambers, with their open shafts and thin stone walls, were magnets for cold. Moisture from below condensed and froze along the seat. Archaeological surveys have even found lime deposits and mineral frost traces along garderobe stones, proof of this chilling reality. To sit there was to endure not only drafts but a literal coating of ice. And yet, medieval people found ways to adapt. There's a curious story from a French household where servants were instructed to warm the seat with hot stones wrapped in cloth before their lord's visit. Picture it: a servant scurrying down the hall, carrying a glowing rock, pressing it carefully against the icy wood, only to have the warmth vanish within minutes. For most people, no such luxury existed. They simply sat, yelped quietly, and endured. There's a peculiar humor in the image of nobles and peasants alike flinching in unison, caught by the same merciless frost. One odd anecdote describes travelers laughing about a companion who leapt up mid-use, shrieking that he'd been bitten by the devil. Everyone knew what he meant: the cruel shock of ice against bare flesh. The story spread, retold in taverns with laughter, though the experience itself was no laughing matter. The practical dangers were real too. Long exposure to icy surfaces risked frostbite. Imagine a child, too small to balance easily, perched on the edge of an ice-rimmed seat. Their skin might stick, tearing painfully when they tried to rise. Servants likely bore scars on their thighs, never spoken of but remembered each winter. Scholars still puzzle over how people managed this recurring torment. Did they sit on layers of clothing? Did they hover, legs trembling, to avoid direct contact? Some evidence suggests that extra fabric was deliberately left loose beneath tunics, to be pulled between skin and wood, like a buffer. Others argue that people simply accepted the pain, much as they accepted chilblains on their fingers and cracked lips in the wind. The silence of the records hints at a resigned tolerance. This was simply life. You imagine yourself now, lowering carefully, a layer of cloak pulled beneath you. It dulls the sting, but only slightly. The draft still cuts, the ice still bites. You clench your teeth and finish as quickly as possible, your thighs trembling from the effort of half sitting, half hovering. The seat creaks under your shifting weight, and a crackling sound reminds you that frost is splintering beneath. When you rise, you rub at your skin, red and stinging. You stamp your feet on the frozen floor, muttering curses, promising yourself you'll never come again unless you must. But of course you will. Everyone must. The ice is part of life, a companion as constant as the moat or the walls. There is an eerie beauty to it, if you pause to notice. The frost glitters in the moonlight through the slit window, tiny crystals catching the glow like stars. The air smells faintly sharp, metallic, almost clean. For a brief second, the chamber feels less like a place of misery and more like a frozen grotto carved into the castle wall. And then the draft rushes up again, and the spell is broken. Think, too, of the symbolism. In a world where castles were meant to embody power and permanence, here is a reminder that nature always had the upper hand. Even kings sat on ice. Even queens hissed at the cold sting. No stone wall, no banner, no roaring hearth could chase winter out of this tiny chamber. It was democracy in its rawest form. All bottoms met the same frost. As you shuffle back down the corridor, your cloak pulled tight, you can't help but reflect on the absurdity. People fought wars, composed poetry, built cathedrals, and yet, every winter night, they still found themselves yelping at icy toilet seats. The contrast is almost comic, almost tragic, a reminder that history is not just battles and crowns, but also shivers and curses in the dark. Back in the hall, you sink onto a bench, warming your hands against the fire. The laughter around you grows louder, the ale sweeter, the music brighter. Yet you know that down the corridor, in the cold stone chamber, frost is still forming, waiting patiently for the next visitor. And so the castle teaches you again: grandeur above, discomfort below. The icy rim of the garderobe is part of the story, as much as the banners in the hall. And in winter, perhaps even more so. You've grown accustomed to the routine now, the cold corridors, the drafty chutes, the icy seats. But there's another layer to this world, one that shapes not only your experience, but the castle's entire environment, where all that waste ended up. You step toward the outer wall again, leaning over a narrow window slit, and you catch sight of the moat below, glazed with ice, faint shapes trapped beneath its surface. It dawns on you that the moat was not just a defense, it was a dump. Castles were designed with waste disposal in mind. One documented practice, especially in England and France, was to build garderobes so that the shafts opened directly into the moat. In theory, the running water would wash everything away. In practice, the moat often became a fetid stew of refuse. Animal bones from the kitchen, rotten vegetables, broken crockery, and endless streams of human waste all met there. In summer, it festered. In winter, it froze into grotesque tableaux. Picture yourself leaning over the parapet and seeing yesterday's dinner preserved beneath a layer of ice, alongside darker stains you'd rather not name. Yet for all its filth, the moat was vital to defense. Soldiers patrolled it, water flowed through it, and attackers had to cross it. The irony is sharp. What was meant to protect also served as the castle's latrine. Chroniclers occasionally noted with dry humour that no army lingered long at the moat's edge, a testament to how foul the stench could be. It was both shield and shame. One especially vivid account tells of a castle under siege where waste was deliberately dumped into the moat to discourage enemy approach. Imagine standing at the wall, watching as enemy soldiers recoil from the reek, gagging as they struggle to ford the foul water. It's grotesque but effective, a reminder that waste wasn't just a nuisance, but sometimes a weapon. And yet, winter changed the game. When the moat froze, the waste didn't drift away, it stayed, encased in ice. Servants and soldiers alike cursed the sight of it. In some winters, people even walked across the frozen moat, trampling over what had been discarded. The image is almost surreal, a noble child skipping across a frozen surface, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the layers of filth locked beneath their feet. Archaeologists today have uncovered remarkable details from moat excavations. Seeds from exotic fruits like figs, traces of imported spices, fish bones, and even lost trinkets have been found amid the muck. These finds reveal what people ate, what they valued, and what they lost. They also reveal parasites and pathogens preserved in the muck for centuries. The moat, in its foulness, became a time capsule. Of course, not every castle had a water-filled moat. Some had dry ditches, and there too waste found its way. Rain and snow carried filth into these trenches, creating heaps of frozen refuse in winter. Servants sometimes shoveled snow into the ditches to cover the stench, turning the moat into a strange blend of natural and human layers. You can imagine the scene, a white blanket of snow dotted with dark streaks where the covering wore thin. The implications were serious. Water sources near castles could be contaminated. Illness spread when people unknowingly drank from streams connected to moats. Some historians argue that outbreaks of dysentery in castles were directly tied to these waste-filled defences. Others suggest the cold months slowed bacteria enough to spare winter garrisons, only for spring thaws to unleash the danger. The debate remains unsettled, much like the waste itself. For the people inside, the moat was a fact of life. They smelled it on the wind, saw it through narrow slits, heard the splashes as servants dumped buckets. It wasn't hidden, it was a constant reminder of human needs. And in winter, when the filth froze solid, it was a visible, almost sculptural presence at the castle's feet. You can almost picture a lord walking the battlements with a guest, gesturing proudly at the frozen moat while carefully avoiding comment on its contents. The grandeur of towers and banners overshadowed by the quiet shame of waste glinting beneath the ice. Visitors might chuckle politely, nobles might look away, but everyone knew. There's even a touch of dark humour here. Imagine a soldier patrolling at night, slipping on the frozen surface of the moat, falling hard onto a patch where waste lurked beneath the ice. His comrades would laugh, he'd curse, and life would go on. Human dignity was fragile in the Middle Ages, especially in winter. You step back from the slit now, drawing your cloak tight. The air carries a faint sour note, drifting up from below despite the frost. It's not overpowering, but it's persistent, a reminder that no matter how thick the walls or how high the towers, the castle cannot hide what its people leave behind. When you return to the hall, the fire feels warmer, the food richer, the laughter brighter. But the memory of the moat stays with you, a frozen mirror of castle life, preserving every meal, every necessity, every secret discarded in the night. And you realize that the story of castles is not just stone and steel, but also water and waste, swirling together beneath the very foundations of power. You've seen how waste dropped into moats and ditches, but winter had one more cruel trick to play. The cold didn't simply freeze what was outside, it crept back up into the castle itself, sometimes choking the very system designed to carry filth away. Tonight you discover what it meant when garderobe shafts froze solid, when nature itself clogged the pipes of stone. Imagine the chute, a narrow shaft running down the thickness of the castle wall, often angled outward to spill into the moat. In summer, gravity did the work, pulling everything downward. But in January, when frost coated stone like glass, the flow slowed. Moisture froze on the sides, narrowing the passage. Each new layer of waste added to the obstruction until, one morning, nothing would pass at all. You lower yourself onto the seat and wait, only to realize with dismay that the shaft below is blocked, a foul crust sealing it shut. Written accounts hint at such blockages. One 15th century steward's record from a northern English castle mentions payments to workers for breaking the frost in the privy chutes. It conjures the image of men crouched outside the walls with iron bars, hacking at iced-over shafts while their breath steamed in the air. The work was brutal. Splinters of ice and filth flew back into their faces, their hands numbed by cold metal tools. They hacked until the chute was clear, cursing under their breath, only to repeat the task again after the next freezing night. A bizarre anecdote even describes how boiling water was occasionally poured down garderobes in an attempt to melt the ice. You can almost hear the hiss and crack as hot liquid met frozen waste, the stench rising in a choking cloud. Servants carrying the steaming buckets must have loathed every step, knowing they would stand above the shaft as the vapor rushed back into their faces. Some castles tried preventative measures. There are notes suggesting straw or hay was dropped into shafts to keep them from freezing solid. the rough fibers discouraging ice from clinging to the stone. Whether it truly worked or not is another matter. One can imagine the servants muttering as they threw bundle after bundle down, only to discover the shaft frozen solid again the next morning. And when the blockage was complete, the consequences spread quickly. The garderobe became unusable. Chamber pots overflowed, stashed in corners longer than anyone liked. The smell, muted by frost, began to gather again, pooling in rooms where waste lingered. Life inside the castle grew tense. Everyone relied on the system, and when it failed, daily rhythms collapsed. Scholars remain divided on just how common these frozen blockages were. Some argue that the shafts were narrow enough and protected enough to remain functional most winters. Others point to the many records of workers clearing privies in January and February as proof that it was a regular crisis. The truth likely lies between. Not every winter was severe, but when the cold was deep, garderobe chutes became icy prisons for the very thing they were built to remove. Now imagine yourself as one of those workers. You stand at the base of the wall, the moat half frozen at your feet, iron bar in hand. The shaft looms above, silent, dark. You raise the bar and strike. The sound echoes, a dull thud followed by a sharp crack. Frost shatters, waste shifts, and a foul lump breaks loose, tumbling past you into the snow. You cough, turn your face away, and swing again. Your hands sting, your shoulders ache, but you keep going. Above, nobles sit by the fire, muttering about the inconvenience. Down here, you are the one who restores their comfort. Inside, the nobles themselves faced humiliation when blockages persisted. There's a story, perhaps exaggerated, of a lord forced to walk outside the walls and relieve himself in the snow because every garderobe in the castle was frozen. His household whispered about it for weeks, laughter muffled behind hands. The idea of a man who commanded soldiers humbled by frozen filth was too delicious to forget. It's almost comic, yet entirely believable. Winter equalized people in strange ways. Lords and servants alike cursed when the chutes clogged, all of them forced to improvise. Chamber pots multiplied. Straw was scattered in corners. Snow was scooped in desperation. Castles that looked invincible from afar were undone by the simplest, most humiliating of problems, a frozen toilet. And then came spring. When the thaw finally arrived, the blockages melted all at once, sending weeks of accumulated filth rushing down in a foul torrent. Imagine the sound, a sudden gurgle, then a roar, followed by a splash that sent even hardened workers stumbling back. The moat filled, the air reeked, and the castle heaved a collective sigh of relief mixed with disgust. The pipes had cleared, but the memory lingered. As you walk back from the garderobe now, cloak brushing the cold stone walls, you can't help but reflect on the fragility of it all. These were fortresses, designed to withstand sieges, to defy armies. Yet they could be defeated by frost. Their walls kept out enemies, but not the creeping cold that turned necessities into burdens. The blocked chute is a perfect metaphor for medieval life, grand on the outside, messy and vulnerable within. You pause in the corridor, listening to the distant hum of voices from the hall. The fire crackles faintly, laughter drifts through the air, but you know that somewhere behind the walls, servants are still hacking at ice, their blows echoing like muffled drums. You picture them swinging iron bars, steam rising from buckets of hot water, curses muttered with every strike. The castle lives and breathes only because of their work, hidden in the cold shadows where nobody cares to look. And you realize, with a shiver, that winter doesn't just freeze water or waste, it freezes dignity too. In a castle, no matter how high the rank, everyone felt the sting of blocked chutes, everyone cursed the frost, and everyone waited impatiently for spring to wash it all away. The clanging of tools outside fades into memory as you make your way deeper into the castle. You've seen blockages hacked apart, watched servants curse the frost, and smelled the thaw. But now you turn your attention to the shafts themselves, the silent stone funnels that guided every drop of waste away from the heart of the fortress. These weren't afterthoughts. They were part of the castle's architecture, and in winter they became both lifelines and instruments of misery. Step inside another garderobe tower, and notice how the chute plunges down through the wall. It isn't random. Builders carved these vertical channels carefully, sometimes angling them outward, so that waste would drop clear of the foundation. In the best designs, the shaft led to running water, carrying filth away. In lesser castles, it simply fell onto bare ground, forming piles that froze into grotesque shapes when the weather turned cold. One piece of archaeological evidence shows how consistent these designs were. Stone garderobe shafts have been found in Norman keeps across England and France. Built as part of the original construction, they were narrow, enclosed, and often smoothed with lime plaster to prevent waste from clinging. Yet winter undermined all those efforts. Frost crept along the lime, condensation froze, and drafts surged up like invisible arrows. The very design that worked so well in summer turned cruel in the depths of January. You lean over the shaft now, listening. The echo is uncanny. A drip, a faint whistle, a hollow resonance that seems to rise from nowhere and everywhere at once. You realize this was more than a toilet chute, it was a sound tube, broadcasting footsteps, coughs, even whispered words from outside. There are stories, strange but persistent, of enemies eavesdropping through garderobe shafts, crouched beneath the walls to catch conversations drifting down. Did it really happen? Some historians doubt it, arguing the sounds would have been too faint. Others insist the shafts acted like primitive amplifiers. The truth remains uncertain, but the possibility makes you shift uneasily. Then there's the darker tale. Enemies using the shafts as entry points. Chronicles tell of soldiers sneaking into castles through waste channels, climbing upward with ropes or scaling frozen piles beneath. Were these stories exaggerated? Likely, but they reveal the vulnerability people felt when perched on a seat above such an opening. In your mind, the shaft below becomes more than a tunnel for waste. It's a hole in the fortress itself, a place where drafts, spirits, and perhaps even enemies could creep in. One odd report even claims that people sometimes dropped refuse deliberately to discourage invaders, chamber pots emptied onto attackers, scaling walls, or filth dumped in haste during sieges. You picture yourself leaning out of the garderobe tower, flinging a bucket downward, the liquid freezing mid-air in the icy night, splattering against armored men below. Brutal, effective, and undignified all at once. But in daily life, the chute's importance was less dramatic. It was simply the channel that kept the castle livable. Without it, the air indoors would choke with filth. With it, life became bearable, even if each visit sent you shivering. You sit on the board again, staring at the dark void, and marvel at how such a simple piece of architecture carried such weight. Of course, not all chutes were equal. In wealthier keeps, shafts might be built in pairs, serving multiple seats in a row. In poorer fortresses, they were crude holes hacked into walls. Servants used smaller, rougher shafts tucked in corners, while lords enjoyed more spacious ones attached to their chambers. Yet the cold equalized them all. A noble backside felt the same icy blast as a peasant's. Curiously, some garderobe towers had multiple levels of shafts stacked atop one another. Waste from the upper levels often cascaded onto ledges before sliding down farther. In summer, this created foul buildups. In winter, those ledges became shelves of frozen filth, waiting for spring to collapse in revolting avalanches. Imagine the horror of walking beneath the walls just as the thaw released a season's worth of frozen debris. There's humor here too. Picture two soldiers perched in garderobes on different floors, one directly above the other, both grimacing at the thought of what might happen if timing went badly. Did accidents occur? Accounts are silent, but the geometry makes you wince at the possibility. Experts continue to puzzle over the efficiency of these systems. Some argue that many shafts must have clogged constantly, forcing servants to chip and scrape year after year. Others suggest they worked surprisingly well, given the sheer number of castles built with them. The debate remains open, but one fact is clear. In winter, Every shaft became a chimney of cold, a channel where frost and filth met in equal measure. You rise from the seat now, cloak pulled tight, staring once more into the void. The shaft seems endless, swallowing sound, swallowing warmth. It is at once an ingenious piece of design and a cruel reminder of the body's needs. You step back into the corridor, the draught following you like a whisper. As you walk, you think about the irony. Castles were monuments to permanence and strength, their walls designed to defy centuries. Yet their most intimate spaces relied on fragile shafts carved into stone, vulnerable to ice, prone to clogging, and sometimes even feared as secret doorways. The grandeur of towers and battlements meant little when your most private act depended on a draughty chute in the wall. You return to the fire, settling once more into the glow. But the memory lingers, the hollow sound of the shaft, the icy gust, the uneasy thought of what might climb upward. You realize that medieval life wasn't just about battles fought on the battlements. It was also about battles fought quietly, nightly, on a seat above a dark chute, praying that the cold, the stench, and the shadows below wouldn't claim you before dawn. The fire crackles low now, throwing long shadows across the hall, and you can almost hear the groans of servants beyond the walls as they trudge about their tasks. If the castle runs on warmth and food for its nobles, it survives on the back-breaking labour of its cleaners. You've glimpsed them before, the pot carriers, the boys with buckets, but tonight you're going to follow their world more closely, into the bleak, freezing work of those tasked with emptying, scrubbing, and shoveling the filth of winter. These men and women were sometimes called gong farmers or gong scourers, names that spoke plainly of their duty. The word gong meant dung. Their work was to clear cesspits, garderobe shafts, and chamber pots. In summer it was revolting. In winter it was torture. Imagine standing in a courtyard at dawn, frost crunching underfoot, while you haul a sloshing bucket of half-frozen waste, your breath clouding in the air, your stomach turning at every step. One account from a manorial household in England describes servants paid an extra fee during January to break the pits because they froze into solid blocks. The workers used picks and shovels, hacking away like miners in reverse. You can picture it. Iron striking ice, clumps breaking free, the stench surging upward even in the cold. The men muttered, gagged, sometimes tied cloths over their mouths. But the job had to be done. Without them, the castle would drown in its own refuse. Curiously, the cold offered one odd benefit. The freezing air dulled the smell. A gong farmer might note, grimly, that he preferred winter shifts, because at least the stench didn't make his eyes water as badly. The waste, hardened into lumps, could be shoveled rather than scooped, yet the work was still filthy, and frostbitten hands didn't make it easier. You imagine their fingers cracked and bleeding, the smell clinging to their skin long after the chore was done. There's a quirky little record from France describing how some workers joked about their trade, calling themselves lords of the pit in mocking tones. Humour was their only defence. You picture them laughing grimly as they haul frozen lumps out of a shaft, tossing insults at one another just to keep spirits up. The laughter echoes strangely in the frozen air, a mix of despair and resilience. But the dangers were real. Workers risked collapsing walls of waste, especially in large cesspits. In summer, suffocation from fumes was a constant hazard. In winter, the threat was frostbite and slipping on icy stone. One story, half tragic, half darkly comic, tells of a man who slipped while clearing a shaft, fell in, and was trapped until his comrades hauled him out. He survived, but the shame followed him for years. The memory of his frozen, foul-soaked figure became a castle joke. Scholars remain divided on how such workers were treated. Some argue they were despised, shunned because of the smell that clung to them. Others point out that their work was indispensable, and records show they were often paid better than other servants. Perhaps they lived in both worlds at once, mocked publicly, but quietly valued by the stewards who relied on them. You crouch in imagination beside one now, watching him scrape at a frozen shaft with a crude wooden shovel. His cloak is ragged, his boots cracked, but his arms swing steadily. He pauses only to spit, mutter, and blow warmth onto his fingers. You realize that without him, the castle's nobles could not enjoy their feasts or warm beds. He bears the hidden burden of their comfort. Consider, too, the endless rhythm of it. Every morning, every evening, every season, someone had to carry the buckets, clear the chutes, scrub the pots. In winter, the work grew slower but heavier, the ice making every task harder. Waste froze to the stone, clung to boards, filled buckets with stubborn lumps. Workers cursed the frost even as they thanked it for dulling the smell. It was a bitter paradox, much like castle life itself. One curious document mentions that some of the waste was collected and used as fertilizer for fields outside the castle. Yes, even frozen blocks of it eventually found their way to soil. Imagine the thaw of spring, when carts trundled through gates carrying lumps of filth to be spread across farmland. It's a detail that ties together castle and countryside, noble feast and peasant harvest, in one grim cycle. You rise now from your mental crouch, brushing frost from your cloak. The gong farmers are still at work, their picks striking stone, their curses sharp in the cold. You step back toward the hall, knowing they'll be here long after you leave, long after the fire dies down, long after the nobles have forgotten the inconvenience of frozen shafts. Their world is thankless, hidden, and grim, but it is also essential. Without them, the castle collapses. Their labor is the unseen foundation beneath the battlements, the silent sacrifice that keeps life running. You realize that history is often written about kings and wars, but it is lived in moments like these, in the weary strokes of a shovel, in the frozen breath of a servant clearing the filth of winter. As you sit by the fire again, you hear faintly the sound of iron on stone, echoing through the night. And you understand that the story of castles is not only about walls and banners, but also about the people who bent their backs in the cold, shoveling the waste that no one else wanted to face. You followed the servants in their grim labor, felt the sting of ice on wooden seats, and smelled the strange mix of herbs and frost. But life inside a castle wasn't all communal benches and drafty shafts. For the highest-ranking nobles, there was a measure of privacy, small chambers built directly into their living quarters, often tucked behind thick curtains or narrow doors. Tonight, you're going to step inside one of these elite garderobes, the kind reserved for lords and ladies. At first glance, it isn't much grander than what you've seen before. The chamber is still small, the air still cold, the shaft still waiting below. But there are differences. The walls may be plastered smooth and painted with faint traces of color. The seat might be carefully carved stone rather than a rough plank, sometimes even padded with cloth in wealthier households. Curtains could be drawn across the opening, giving a sense of seclusion. The privilege wasn't warmth exactly, but it was dignity. Evidence from royal and aristocratic castles shows that such private garderobes were common. Documents from Windsor and Kenilworth mention closets attached to chambers, spaces set aside for private use. The architecture still funneled waste outward, but the setting was closer to the lord's bed, sparing him the trek down freezing corridors. This alone was a luxury worth noting. Imagine being able to step only a few feet from your chamber, rather than braving the icy drafts of the outer towers. You draw the curtain and sit carefully on the seat. The air is still cold, no amount of status can banish that, but the space feels quieter, more intimate. A brazier may sometimes be kept nearby, its embers faintly glowing. The smell is lighter here too, masked by fragrant herbs burned in small dishes. You can almost believe, for a moment, that you are apart from the harsher realities of the castle. One odd but telling detail from noble households is the presence of small shelves or niches in these private garderobes. On them sat cloths for wiping, sprigs of herbs, or even wax tablets for writing notes while seated. You smile at the thought of a baron drafting letters while perched above the shaft, quills scratching in the cold air. It seems absurd, but it shows how these chambers became part of daily routine, not just necessity. And yet, even here, the cold intrudes. The shaft still breathes icy, drafts upward. The stone seat still bites. You sit, wrapped in furs, and realize that rank offers little protection against nature. The lord's thighs numb just as quickly as the servants'. The lady's sigh at the cold air is the same as the laundress's. In the end, the castle's stone walls mock everyone equally. There's a curious anecdote recorded in a Burgundian household. A noblewoman insisted her garderobe be lined with velvet for the winter months. The servants dutifully arranged it, only to find the cloth soaked and fouled within days. The experiment was abandoned in disgust. It illustrates the futility of trying to outwit winter with finery. Practical wool and bare stone outlasted velvet every time. Still, nobles found small comforts. Heated stones wrapped in cloth might be placed on the floor, warming the feet while their lord used the chamber. Windows might be covered with shutters to block the worst of the draught. Incense burned in brass pots filled the air with frankincense or cinnamon, costly imports reserved for the elite. You imagine the smell now, rich, spicy, almost holy, mixing with the sharper odors of reality. It's both improvement and irony, luxury and futility in the same breath. Debate continues among historians about how much privacy nobles truly enjoyed. Some argue these garderobes were still vulnerable to sound and smell, hardly secluded. Others point out that their mere location adjacent to private chambers made them vastly more convenient than the trek to communal latrines. What is clear is that they symbolized rank. A personal toilet was as much a marker of power as a coat of arms. You sit quietly, imagining the Lord himself here. He is wrapped in a fur cloak, muttering about the cold, perhaps scrawling notes on a tablet or rehearsing tomorrow's orders. Outside the curtain, servants wait, listening, ready to fetch water or herbs. It is privacy, yes, but never solitude. Even the most private moments of noble life were touched by service and ceremony. There's an uneasy humor in this. The man who commands soldiers, the woman who rules a household, both reduced to shivering figures perched over a shaft. Their garderobe may be finer, but their discomfort is the same. You realize, sitting here, that castles were not just about rank and power. They were also about shared human needs, dressed in furs and incense, but still fundamentally the same. When you leave the chamber, you pull the curtain closed, the scent of incense clinging to your cloak. You step back into the larger chamber where tapestries hang and braziers glow. The warmth returns, and with it, the illusion of superiority. But the memory of the icy seat behind the curtain lingers, a reminder that no matter how high the rank, the body's needs humbled everyone in the frozen winters of the Middle Ages. The incense and velvet curtains of noble garderobes still linger in your memory, but the moment you step away from those slightly softened chambers, reality returns. For most people in the castle, there was no privacy, no painted plaster, no brazier waiting. The servants lived in the shadows of nobility, their bodies just as urgent, their needs just as constant, but their facilities were harsher, barer, and always more exposed to the cold. Picture the lower reaches of the castle, the kitchens with their smoky haze, the sculleries damp with spilled water, the barracks where guards rolled in rough blankets. Somewhere nearby, tucked against the wall, is a crude garderobe meant for the staff. It is smaller, darker, and far less maintained than the Lord's chamber closet. The stone walls are wet to the touch, condensation freezing in streaks that glitter faintly by torchlight. The seat is a splintered board, patched together from whatever wood was left. There is no curtain, no shelf with herbs, just a hole above a chute and the winter air rushing up without mercy. Records from household accounts hint at this division. Where nobles had separate garderobes adjoining their chambers, servants and retainers shared communal ones near work areas. Archaeology supports it. Excavations in kitchens and gatehouses often reveal smaller shafts, rough, hewn and narrow, clearly intended for staff use. The difference is stark, and tonight you sit down on one of these crude boards to feel it for yourself. The cold here is sharper, because the chamber is closer to the open air. The wind whistles louder, the draught fiercer. There is no brazier to dull the sting, no incense to soften the odor. The smell is raw, earthy, almost violent, only slightly muted by frost. You tug your cloak around you, but it does little. The wooden seat is rough beneath you, and the air makes your eyes water. One peculiar note from a servant's testimony centuries later recalls how the lower garderobes froze so quickly in winter that people would rather use chamber pots in corners of the kitchen than endure them. You can almost see it. Cooks crouched beside the hearth, furtively using a pot while the stew bubbled nearby, muttering that at least the fire kept them warm. Dignity was a luxury in the Middle Ages, especially for those without rank. There's a grim humour in the image of a noble feasting in the hall above, while a servant scurried down to a freezing hole in the wall, teeth chattering, cloak flapping. The servant's world was a mirror of the lord's stripped of comfort. Where nobles sat behind curtains, servants perched in the open. Where lords had incense, servants had smoke from the kitchen clinging to their hair. And yet, some small acts of ingenuity appeared even here. Servants sometimes lined the seat with straw to dull the bite of the cold. Others used scraps of old cloth, worn thin from years of use, laid across the wood. These makeshift solutions offered a moment's relief, though they rarely lasted. Imagine lowering yourself onto straw frozen stiff, the crunch echoing in the tiny space. It helps, but only just. Experts argue over whether staff garderobes were regularly cleaned or left to accumulate filth until unbearable. Some suggest they were emptied often, to keep work areas functional. Others believe they were neglected, servants left to endure the smell and mess because their comfort mattered less. Perhaps both were true, depending on the steward's diligence. You sit now in the imagined gloom and realize how invisible these places must have been to nobles, how forgotten by chroniclers, yet how central to the daily life of those who kept the castle running. Think of the endless rhythm of the servants' day, hauling firewood, carrying water, scrubbing floors, tending animals. They worked from before dawn until long past dusk, and in the middle of all this, when their bodies demanded relief, they trudged to a freezing little chamber, muttering curses into the dark. You can almost hear it, the scrape of boots, the hiss of breath, the weary sigh as someone settled onto the icy seat before hurrying back to the kitchen fire. One unusual practice mentioned in a few sources is that some servants relieved themselves outdoors, even in winter, rather than face the communal latrine. Behind barns in corners of the courtyard, in snowdrifts at the edge of walls, they chose open air over foul, crowded shafts. The snow itself muffled smells and covered evidence. It was undignified, but so was everything else in their world. And here's where the contrast grows sharpest. Above, nobles muttered about draughts while wrapped in fur. Below, servants shivered on bare wood, their cloaks thin, their shoes worn. Both cursed the cold, but only one side had the option to complain loudly. The other simply endured. As you stand and step back into the corridor, you realize the truth. The castle's grandeur rested on the backs of those who used these dark, freezing closets. They endured filth so that others could enjoy feasts. They shivered so that others could sit in velvet. Their bodies were no less human, their needs no less pressing, but their comfort mattered less. You walk back toward the hall, your footsteps echoing. The torches flicker, the air carries both smoke and sourness, and you can't help but think that history is often written about kings and queens while forgetting the servants who froze in the shadows. Their garderobes were bare, their dignity thin, but their story as part of the castle too etched into the cold stone, whispered in the draughts, endured in silence through every bitter winter. The echoes of servant life fade as you make your way toward the outer courtyard, where the air is even sharper, stinging your cheeks like a whip. Castles weren't closed worlds. They were crossroads of travel merchants, messengers, and noble guests came and went, carrying news, gifts, and sometimes trouble. And whenever winter wrapped the fortress in ice, these travelers too needed relief. Their accommodations were often improvised, uncomfortable, and memorable for all the wrong reasons. Picture a company of visiting knights arriving after a long ride. Their cloaks are stiff with frost, their horses steaming in the cold air. They're ushered into the hall for food and warmth. But before long, the need arises. Where do guests go when they're not at home and no chamber pot is tucked beneath their bed? Sometimes they were directed to the communal garderobes, those draughty stone chambers you've seen before. Imagine the awkwardness. A knight of high reputation perched on a splintered seat beside the castle's servants, both of them shivering in silence. Rank shrinks when cold draughts rise. But not every host risked such humiliation. For distinguished visitors, temporary wooden privies could be constructed outside, often little more than boxes with a hole over a pit. In summer, that was tolerable. In winter, it was an ordeal. The wood turned icy, the pit froze solid, and the wind tore through the gaps like knives. One practical detail from travel records tells us that portable seats existed, wooden chairs with holes, sometimes carried on carts for long journeys. Nobles brought these with them to avoid the indignities of shared garderobes. You can picture a squire dragging such a chair into a draughty guest room, placing a bucket beneath, and bowing out. It offered privacy, yes, but little comfort when the water in the bucket froze overnight. And then there were the makeshift solutions. Snowbanks, corners of barns, hastily dug pits. Chroniclers rarely mention these moments, but they must have happened often. You can imagine a messenger stepping outside on a freezing night, cloak pulled tight, squatting hurriedly behind a wall while the wind howled. No velvet, no incense, just necessity, raw and humbling. An unusual anecdote survives from a 15th century Burgundian household. A guest complained bitterly about being offered a latrine of straw, a simple pit lined with hay. His letter drips with disdain, but it reveals how even nobles sometimes faced crude arrangements when travelling in winter. The castle could only offer so much, and when visitors outnumbered garderobes, improvisation ruled. Scholars still debate how often castles built temporary wooden privies for guests. Some argue they were common at large, gatherings, weddings, feasts, tournaments, especially when overflow crowds filled the halls. Others doubt such effort was frequent, pointing out that chamber pots were simpler. Either way, guests relied on whatever was available, and in winter that often meant shivering in corners, muttering curses in languages from across Christendom. You picture now a banquet night. The hall is packed with guests from distant lands, music playing, goblets clinking. But outside, down the corridors, the garderobes are overwhelmed. Lines form. Servants shuffle nervously. Guests shift impatiently, and the cold air rushes in each time the door opens. Somewhere near the stables, carpenters hammer together wooden booths to catch the overflow. Inside, the boards creak, the wind whistles, and the pit below begins to freeze. No troubadour sings of these scenes, yet they were as real as the feast itself. There's a comedic element too. Imagine travellers whispering about the toilets after the feast, comparing castles like modern people compare hotels. The wine was fine, but the privy was unbearable. One knight might grumble. Another laughs, claiming he nearly lost a finger to frost when he tried to wipe with snow. These moments, small and human, bridge the gap between noble houses more surely than treaties. Back in your own mind, you step into a guest chamber now. It's smaller than the lord's, with a narrow bed and a chest in the corner. Beneath the bed sits a simple pot, plain clay, unadorned. You kneel, lift it, feel its surface cold as stone. It's a humble object, yet tonight it's your salvation. You use it quickly, return it to its place, and crawl back beneath your blankets, grateful not to walk the corridor. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind howls across the moat, but for now, you're safe. As dawn approaches, servants will come to empty the pots, scrub the wooden booths, and scatter fresh straw. The cycle continues, unseen by chroniclers, unpraised in songs, but remembered in the mutters of travellers who endured it. and you realize that the story of castles wasn't only written in banners and battles, but also in the awkward complaints of guests clutching their cloaks on freezing nights, muttering that the wine was strong, but the privy stronger. The bustle of guests fades from your mind as you step through another passageway, this one lined with stone arches that echo faintly when you walk. The sound feels familiar, almost reverent, and before long you realize why. You've wandered into the cloisters of a monastery attached to the castle grounds. Not every fortress had monks nearby, but many did, and their way of handling winter toilets was as distinctive as their chanting prayers. Tonight, you're going to sit among the brethren and learn what it meant to use a monastic latrine when frost clung to every surface. Unlike the cramped garderobes of the castle, the monastic latrine or reredoter, as it was often called, was built for communal use on a scale that makes you pause. Imagine a long hall, stone walls thick, roof pitch steep, with a row of wooden seats stretching side by side like a bench without end. Beneath them ran a channel of water, sometimes diverted from a stream, intended to carry waste away. In summer, the water trickled steadily. In winter, it slowed, froze, and often failed. One reliable description comes from Cistercian monasteries, where these long latrines were part of daily life. They were practical, efficient, and utterly devoid of privacy. Dozens of monks sat in silence, their habits lifted, the only sounds the faint splashes below, or the whistle of wind through stone. The communal nature matched their ideals of humility. What was private in noble castles was shared here, a reminder that all were equal before God. Yet, when January winds howled through the cloisters, humility turned into suffering. Picture yourself now on one of those benches, perched between two monks, your breath fogs, mingling with theirs. The draught blows steadily along the row, turning the hall into a wind tunnel. The wooden seat beneath you creaks, its surface rimed with frost. You try to keep still, hands tucked into your sleeves, but the cold gnaws relentlessly. And here lies an odd little note. Some monasteries scheduled bathroom visits at set times, usually in the early morning. Imagine the scene: rows of monks trudging through the cloister in silence, robes swishing, sandals slapping against icy stone. They file into the reredoter, sit in solemn stillness, and do their business together, as much ritual as necessity. For them, the cold wasn't just inconvenience. It was discipline, another way to mortify the flesh. The sting of icy draughts became part of spiritual life. But even monks had their limits. Records show that herbs were sometimes strewn across the floor to dull odors, and woolen cloaks allowed in winter despite strict rules of simplicity. There's even a curious mention of monks warming stones by the kitchen fire and carrying them secretly to the latrines, tucking them under robes for a little warmth during their visit. You can't help but smile at the image. Holy men sneaking hot stones into a chamber of silence, each trying to outlast the cold without breaking their vow. Of course, problems arose when water channels froze solid. Without flow beneath the seats, the waste accumulated quickly. Servants, often lay brothers or hired laborers, had to hack away at the frozen buildup, shoveling it out into carts. Imagine the sound of picks striking ice beneath a line of seats. The monks above sitting stiffly, faces pale in the bitter air, the rhythm of prayer and labor intertwined in the strangest way. Scholars remain divided on how sanitary these systems truly were. Some argue that monastic latrines, with their water channels, were more advanced than castle garderobes. Others point out that frozen channels turned them into cesspits, no cleaner than the moat-fed shafts of fortresses. The evidence tilts both ways, but one thing is clear. In winter, neither system offered much relief. You shift uneasily on your imagined bench, glancing at the monk beside you. His face is calm, his breath steady, his eyes lowered. For him, this discomfort is part of life, a trial to be endured with patience. You, however, are less saintly. Your skin burns from the cold, your nose wrinkles at the smell, and your mind drifts back to the warm fire in the castle hall. The contrast is almost unbearable. And yet, there's a strange comfort in the shared experience. No one here pretends to be above it. Lords and ladies might shroud themselves in incense, but monks embraced the humility of sitting side by side. No rank, no division, just men facing the same draught. Perhaps that's why the memory of these latrines lingers in records. They embodied the equality of the cloister, however uncomfortable. As you rise and leave the hall, your sandals slapping against stone, you glance back at the row of seats. They stretch like a silent choir, frozen, waiting for the next procession. Outside, snow falls quietly in the cloister garden, blanketing herbs and bare trees. The monastery breathes its rhythm of prayer and cold, discipline and endurance. And you realize that winter toilets were not just about necessity here, they were woven into the very fabric of spiritual life. You step back toward the castle, the chanting of monks fading behind you, replaced by the crackle of torches and the distant laughter of nobles. Two worlds, two ways of life, yet both humbled in the same way by cold stone, icy draughts, and the inescapable truth of the human body. The chanting of monks fades behind you, but the image of that long, icy bench remains in your mind. The communal silence, the discipline, the draughts, it all lingers as you step back into the castle proper. Yet there's another dimension to these frozen privies, one that stretches beyond daily misery. Castles were machines of defense, and sometimes even their toilets carried strategic meaning. Tonight, you'll find yourself staring at a garderobe, not as a burden, but as a potential battlefield. Stand now on the outer wall, where a small stone projection juts from the masonry. You know what it is, even before you duck inside. A garderobe, built to hang above the moat. From the inside, it's the same as always, a narrow cubicle, a wooden seat, a shaft dropping into darkness. But from the outside, it looks like a weakness, a literal hole in the fortress wall. And enemies noticed. Contemporary chronicles record tales of sieges where attackers considered garderobe shafts as possible entry points. They were narrow, yes, and foul, but desperate men do desperate things. One story from a Scottish castle tells of soldiers climbing up a shaft under cover of night, emerging inside the walls before the garrison knew what had happened. The tale may be embellished, but it captures the unease. While you shivered above the chute, someone might be climbing below. Imagine the tension. You sit in the freezing dark, cloak drawn tight, breath fogging in front of you. The draft whistles upward, and you wonder if the sound is just the wind, or if it's footsteps echoing from below. You glance downward, but the shaft shows only darkness. A paranoid thought creeps in. What if an enemy is scaling upward as you perch here, utterly exposed? Suddenly, the most private act becomes a moment of vulnerability. One archaeological survey notes that some garderobe shafts were deliberately designed with sharp bends or angled drops, making them harder to climb. Others had iron grates partway down, not to stop waste, but to block intruders. It's a fascinating glimpse into medieval priorities. Even toilets were fortified. Yet in smaller castles, or in those built in haste, such precautions were missing. The shaft remained a straight tunnel, a shadowed invitation. There's an amusing anecdote from French sources about a guard who refused to use the garderobe during a siege, convinced that enemies were lurking beneath. Instead, he relieved himself in a bucket in the guardroom. His comrades teased him mercilessly, but when attackers were later discovered probing the shaft, he claimed vindication. It's part comedy, part cautionary tale, and it shows how fear could twist even the simplest bodily act. Not all military use of garderobes came from below. Defenders sometimes weaponized them from above. Chronicles describe garrisons emptying chamber pots or dumping refuse on attackers scaling walls. The thought is grotesque but effective. A sudden rain of icy filth could scatter men on ladders more surely than arrows. In winter, when the contents froze, the danger was even greater. Imagine chunks of frozen waste hurled down, clattering against helmets, sending men stumbling into the moat. Brutality came in many forms, and castles used every resource. Historians remain divided on just how often garderobes played a role in sieges. Some insist the tales are exaggerated, products of imagination rather than fact. Others point to structural evidence, unusually angled shafts, signs of blocked or reinforced openings as proof that the threat was taken seriously. Whether common or rare, the very existence of these stories tells you how people viewed the toilet not just as a necessity, but as a potential crack in the armor of stone. Now imagine yourself walking the wall on a frozen night. The torches gutter in the wind, your breath streams white, and your eyes wander to that little projection. You picture yourself inside it, vulnerable, perched above an opening that leads straight into the moat. Suddenly the cold draft doesn't feel like the only danger. You wrap your cloak tighter, glancing nervously into the shadows, ears straining for sounds that aren't there. And yet, despite the risks, the garderobe remained. Castles couldn't function without them. They were a weakness, yes, but also a lifeline. Better to risk a shaft in the wall than a cesspit in the middle of the hall. The balance between hygiene and defense was never perfect. It was compromise carved into stone, endured winter after winter, siege after siege. As you step away from the projection, the irony lingers. The same shaft that made you shiver at midnight could one day serve as an enemy's ladder or a defender's weapon. Toilets were not just private chambers, but hidden battlegrounds, woven into the story of medieval war as surely as drawbridges and towers. You return to the hall, shaking the snow from your cloak, the fire's warmth wrapping around you once more. But you know that somewhere along the wall, another garderobe juts out into the dark, its shaft descending into shadow, both necessary and dangerous. And in the heart of winter, when every draught cuts sharper, that mix of comfort and vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. The thought of garderobes as siege weaknesses still clings to your mind as you pace back toward the inner chambers. The great hall's fire offers light, but tonight you wander deeper into the castle's underbelly, down narrow steps that twist into darkness. Here, beneath the walls, you find the cesspits, those hidden vaults where waste collected, where cold turned filth into brittle layers, and where the air hung heavy with the smell of centuries. Imagine stepping into this space. The walls drip with condensation, the ceiling low enough that you must stoop. Torches sputter, their smoke curling against damp stone. At your feet lies a pit, half frozen, its surface a patchwork of ice and dark water. Crusted lumps jut upward, glinting faintly in the flame. Every step crunches against frost or slush. You cover your mouth with your cloak, but the smell still presses in, earthy, acrid, unrelenting. Even in winter, when frost muffles odors, the pit breathes its history. Archaeologists have uncovered astonishing finds from such cesspits. Seeds of figs, grapes and barley, bones of pigs and chickens, fragments of leather shoes, broken toys, even jeweled hairpins. Waste was more than excrement, it was the record of life. Frozen winters preserved it in layers, and centuries later, spades and trowels reveal meals eaten, games played, illnesses endured. The cesspit was an archive, though no one at the time would have seen it that way. But in its own era, the cesspit was feared. One chronicle tells of a pit overflowing after weeks of frost, the thaw releasing a torrent that flooded the lower chambers. Servants had to wade knee-deep in filth to clear it, their cries echoing through stone corridors. The tale is half grotesque, half tragic, yet entirely believable. You can imagine the horror as ice cracked, the stench rising like a ghost released. Sometimes the pits froze solid, and then work ground to a halt. Waste piled higher in garderobes and pots while servants waited for a thaw. In desperation, some poured hot water to melt layers, but the steam choked them, carrying fumes that made eyes burn and throats ache. Others hacked at the ice with shovels, chips flying like sparks in the torchlight. Their hands grew raw, the cold mixing with filth until their very skin stank. There's a curious anecdote from a German castle, where cesspit workers claimed to hear voices in the ice, groans, sighs, whispers carried through frozen tunnels. They believed spirits haunted the waste, trapped by sin and filth. Perhaps it was only the creaking of frost, the shifting of ice under pressure. But in the half-dark, With every surface glistening and foul, belief was easy. You shiver, wondering if you too might hear the same phantom murmurs if you stayed long enough. Debate continues among historians about how often these pits were emptied. Some argue they were cleared only rarely, when absolutely full. Others believe maintenance was seasonal, tied to winter freezes and spring thaws. What seems certain is that the work was dreaded. Men were lowered by ropes, shovels in hand, to dig out the thick sludge and haul it up in buckets. In January, those buckets froze between lifts, their contents clattering like stones. The workers cursed, their arms burning, their faces streaked with grime. And yet, the cesspit wasn't always hidden away. In some castles, pits opened directly into courtyards or streams. You can imagine walking across a snowy yard, crunching over drifts, only to pass a dark hole rimed with frost where steam still rose faintly. The castle's grandeur coexisted with such grim sights, unavoidable and unforgettable. One servant's account recalls how children dared each other to throw stones onto the frozen surface of a pit, laughing as the ice cracked, then running in terror when the smell burst upward. Childhood mischief and filth collided in those moments, weaving strange memories into castle life. You stand now above the imagined pit, torchlight flickering across ice. You hear the faint drip of thawing frost, the creak of shifting layers, the low murmur of water beneath. The air burns your nostrils, and you turn away, cloak pressed tight to your face. The stone steps carry you upward again, back toward fresher air, though the smell clings stubbornly, as if it has soaked into your very skin. When you emerge into the corridor, you breathe deeply, grateful for the cleaner draught. Yet you know the cesspit remains below, frozen but waiting. It is the unseen heart of the castle's system, hated yet essential, hidden yet unforgettable. And as you walk toward the hall once more, you realize how much these pits tell about the people who lived above them. They reveal their meals, their fears, their winters endured. They remind you that castles weren't only stone towers and roaring fires, they were also frozen vaults of filth, silent witnesses to the humblest and harshest truths of medieval survival. You climb away from the cesspit, glad to leave the stink behind, but the memory clings. Even in the cleanest chambers, even by the brightest fire, you carry that sense of filth lurking beneath the stone. And now you notice how much of daily life in the castle is shaped by the rhythm of maintenance servants hauling, scrubbing, sweeping, always at war with the cold and the smell. Tonight, you're going to follow the routines that kept the system from collapsing during the harshest months. Picture the break of day in January. The castle stirs slowly, the sky still pale with frost. Servants rise before the nobles, stamping their feet on icy floors, pulling on cloaks that never quite dry. Their first tasks are familiar: rekindle the hearths, fetch water, prepare bread. But a group of them has a different duty: latrine service. They take up buckets, brushes of bundled twigs, and rough cloths, and they march into the freezing corridors where garderobes wait. One consistent fact from household roles is that such maintenance was daily. Even if cesspits weren't emptied often, the seats and shafts required constant attention. Wood swelled with damp, straw needed replacing, and frost made boards slippery. Imagine crouching in the cold, scrubbing a seat with icy water and ash soap, the liquid running down your sleeves until your hands go numb. You gag at the smell, but you keep working, because the steward will check. Some castles attempted cleverness. Archaeological finds reveal lime plaster smeared along garderobe walls, not only to smooth stone, but also to fight odors and bacteria. Workers reapplied it when frost cracked the surface, hauling buckets of lime down narrow steps. You picture them slopping the mixture, their hands raw, the air stinging with chalky dust. It didn't erase the smell, but it slowed decay, a small victory against endless filth. And then there was the ash. Fires in the great hall produced heaps of wood ash, and servants carried it to scatter into garderobes. The ash dried waste, dulled the odor, and even provided grit to scrub seats. In winter, Ash froze into clumps, heavy and awkward to carry, but the work continued. You imagine a boy staggering with a basket, spilling grey dust across the corridor, leaving footprints like ghostly echoes on the stone. One odd record from France mentions salt scattered into latrines during frost, meant to keep liquid waste from freezing solid. Was it effective? Perhaps a little, but salt was valuable, and some stewards grumbled at the waste. You can hear them now, muttering as they sprinkle handfuls into the shaft, watching the crystals vanish into the dark, wondering whether the Lord's purse truly allowed it. Of course, no matter how much ash or lime or salt was used, the work was never enough. In winter, problems multiplied. Chamber pots overflowed because no one wanted to walk the icy corridors. Rushes stank faster because windows stayed shut. Waste froze to stone and wood, refusing to budge. Servants had to chip it away with knives, scraping while their fingers cracked from the cold. The sound of iron against frozen filth was as much a part of castle mornings as the clang of the smithy. And here comes a peculiar note of humour. Some workers carved little notches into their shovels, claiming it made the scraping easier. Others nicknamed their tools Devil's Teeth or the Winter's Bite. These small jokes carried them through long days. You smile at the thought of two men swinging picks in a frozen shaft, laughing grimly as they argue which notch made the work faster. Experts continue to debate whether castles had designated teams for this labour or whether it rotated among lower servants. Some accounts suggest entire groups of workers specialised in latrines, despised for their smell but valued for their necessity. Others hint that any servant could be ordered into the task at a steward's command. The truth may have varied from place to place, but in every castle, someone faced the daily battle, unseen by nobles but essential for survival. Now place yourself in their shoes. It's dawn, your breath clouds before you, and the steward thrusts a broom of twigs into your hand. You trudge down the corridor, heart heavy, muttering under your breath. You push open the garderobe door, and the draft greets you instantly. You scrape, you scrub, you dump ash, you replace straw. The cold bites your fingers, the smell curls around you, but you keep going, because you must. And when you're done, you leave silently, unseen, ready to start again tomorrow. One strange comfort was the knowledge that winter slowed disease. Servants sometimes remarked that the smell was less, the sickness fewer. Frost dulled the stench that in summer brought flies and fevers. It was small consolation, but it mattered. You can imagine one worker shrugging and saying, "At least the stink sleeps in winter," before returning to his chores. But the relief was temporary. Spring always came, and with it the thaw. All the layers of frozen filth suddenly softened, smells surged back, and the work redoubled. Winter was misery, yes, but it was also reprieve. That paradox defined life in the castle, comfort and torment, side by side, bound by the turning of the seasons. You climb the stairs back toward the great hall, your imagination heavy with the sound of scrubbing and scraping. The nobles never saw it, but the castle's smooth operation depended on those unseen rhythms. Maintenance was survival, carried out in silence, endured in frost, forgotten in chronicles but remembered in the bones of the walls themselves. When you settle once more by the fire, the laughter of nobles in your ears, you know the truth. Every warm feast, every cheerful song, every roaring blaze was built on the back of servants battling filth in the cold. Their labour, hidden and humble, was the foundation of castle life. And without it, no lord, no lady, no knight could have endured even a single winter. You've watched servants scrub boards, scatter ash, and chip frozen filth from stone. But maintenance wasn't the only concern. A castle, after all, was home to more than nobles and workers. It was also a world alive, with animals, dogs prowling kitchens, cats hunting mice, birds wheeling overhead, and rats nesting wherever food or warmth could be found. And when winter pressed in, these creatures found their way into garderobes and cesspits, turning toilets into strange ecosystems. Tonight, you'll peer into the dark, not just for draughts and filth, but for glowing eyes and skittering paws. Step into a narrow chamber once more. The torchlight flickers against the shaft, shadows twisting. You lean closer, listening. At first you hear only the moan of wind, but then comes a faint, scurrying sound. It's unmistakable. Rats. They thrive here, feeding on scraps dropped down the chute. In summer, they swarm. In winter, they huddle in frozen nests, darting out to gnaw at hardened lumps of refuse. You imagine sitting above the shaft, shivering, while the sound of squeaks rises beneath you. It makes your skin crawl. Archaeological digs in medieval cesspits confirm this reality. Rat bones, gnawed seeds, and burrows carved into layers of waste tell the story clearly. The garderobe shaft was not just a toilet, it was a pantry for vermin. And with vermin came fleas, spreading silently through straw floors and woolen cloaks. The cold slowed them, yes, but it never truly stopped them. Every winter, castle folk prayed for relief, and every spring, the pests returned in force. One odd detail from chronicles even describes cats stationed near garderobes, meant to keep the rats in check. Imagine a skinny cat prowling the icy chamber, eyes glowing in the torchlight, tail flicking as it waits for movement in the shadows. You sit on the board above, breath fogging, praying the cat doesn't leap into your lap mid-use. It's both absurd and plausible, a small defense in a world where every corner teemed with life. And rats weren't the only intruders. Birds, too, found their way in. Open shafts meant open skies, and sparrows or pigeons sometimes swooped through, especially when snow covered the ground outside. A startled flutter of wings in the dark could turn a cold visit into a moment of panic. Picture yourself gripping the wooden seat, heart racing, as feathers whip past your face in the gloom. You mutter a curse under your breath, swearing you'll never visit again without a lantern. But the strangest intruders of all were the insects that clung to life even in winter. Chronicles mention lice and worms, parasites that plagued every class of society. In the frozen garderobe, they slowed but never died. The shafts became breeding grounds, waiting to revive when warmth returned. People knew it, feared it, and muttered about invisible creatures in the air. They lacked the language of germs, but they sensed something lurking. Scholars remain divided on how much vermin influenced medieval health. Some argue that rats in garderobes were a minor nuisance, overshadowed by greater problems like contaminated water. Others suggest they were a constant source of disease, spreading silently in straw and wool. The evidence is compelling either way, but for you, perched above the shaft, the scurrying sound is enough. There's a dark humor here, too. Imagine a servant stumbling into the garderobe at night, torch in hand, only to find two rats frozen mid-climb on the icy shaft, their little bodies stuck fast. He kicks them loose, mutters about God's judgment, and goes about his business. Later, children discover the frozen creatures in the yard, laughing as they hurl them like stones across the snow. It's grotesque, yet entirely believable in a world where survival left little room for sentiment. Dogs, too, played their part. Kitchen hounds scavenged bones and sometimes strayed near the garderobe pits, sniffing curiously at the frozen heaps. Some records hint that dogs even dug into waste piles, a habit that horrified stewards but persisted nonetheless. You can almost see it, a mutt bounding into the hall, muzzle smeared, wagging happily while nobles wrinkle their noses. The laughter would be uneasy, the disgust universal. And then there are the stories, half myth, half warning, of snakes or eels lurking in watery moats, slithering upward through shafts. Did anyone truly face such horrors? Likely not, but the fear was real enough. Cold draughts, strange noises, and shadows moving in the dark made people imagine anything. You can picture a servant swearing he saw an eel rise from the shaft, his tail spreading through the castle until no one dared sit without glancing down nervously. One particularly quirky practice aimed at keeping vermin at bay was the scattering of sharp thorns in shafts. Accounts from rural households describe this, though whether castles followed suit is unclear. Still, the idea of a shaft studded with brambles is vivid. Did it stop rats? Perhaps. Did it scratch anyone foolish enough to lean too far? Almost certainly. You rise from the seat now, pulling your cloak tight, ears still tuned to faint scurries below. You step back into the corridor, relieved, yet uneasy. The castle is alive, not just with nobles and servants, but with creatures sharing every corner. Their presence shaped the experience of winter toilets as much as drafts or frost. To sit in the garderobe was not just to endure cold, it was to share space with rats, cats, birds, and whatever else crept through stone and shadow. As you walk back to the hall, you realize how much these creatures blurred the line between fortress and wilderness. The walls kept out armies, but not vermin. The moat froze, but life stirred within it. Winter numbed smells, but it didn't silence squeaks. And so the castle breathed with more than human voices. It carried the pulse of all the animals that found shelter, food, and mischief in its very waste. You sink once more by the fire, the warmth wrapping around you, but your imagination refuses to let go. You picture glowing eyes in the shaft, wings fluttering in the dark, claws scratching against ice. And you understand that medieval life was never solitary. Even in your most private moment, you were never truly alone. The fire's glow soothes your nerves after the imagined flutter of wings and the scratching of rats. Yet another thought gnaws at you. You've seen how nobles and monks endured their freezing chambers, how servants scraped frost and shoveled filth, how animals prowled in the shadows. But what of the women who lived here, ladies, maids, and daughters? How did they navigate these icy garderobes in layers of skirts, with dignity always under scrutiny, in the heart of the coldest winters? Tonight, you step quietly into their world. Imagine the lady of the castle in her chamber, wrapped in fur-lined gowns, her hair bound carefully, her honor tied to every action. She rises in the night, lantern flickering in her hand, her breath pale in the dark. She must walk to a private garderobe, or more likely in deep winter, reach for a chamber pot tucked discreetly beneath a stool. The pot is glazed with painted flowers, perhaps imported, perhaps gifted. It's cold to the touch, biting even through cloth. She shivers as she uses it, then covers it quickly, grateful for the privacy of her curtains. The chamber is not warm, but at least it's her own. Now picture her maid. She too needs relief. But her chamber holds no velvet-draped bed, no painted pot. Instead, she hurries down the corridor toward a communal seat. Her skirts tangle around her ankles as she lifts them, her fingers stiff with cold. She balances awkwardly on the rough board, the icy draft rushing upward, her teeth clenched against a gasp. It is undignified, uncomfortable, and wholly unavoidable. When she finishes, she arranges her skirts quickly, hoping no one saw, because for women, reputation clung even to the most basic moments. One well-recorded observation from medieval texts is that women often used cloths for wiping linen or wool scraps, sometimes kept in baskets beside the chamber pot. Laundresses then faced the thankless task of boiling and scrubbing them. Imagine a washerwoman in January, breaking ice on the water trough, her hands raw and cracked as she stirs a pot of steaming linen. The smell rises, the steam scalds, and she mutters prayers that spring will come soon. There's a quirky note, too. In some households, women sprinkled rose petals or lavender into their pots, believing it masked odors and maintained modesty. Archaeologists have even found traces of flower pollen in cesspit layers. You can almost see it, ladies casting petals into their chamber pots, clinging to a sense of refinement amid the cold. A fragile act of beauty, fragile as the petals themselves. But dignity was never guaranteed. Winter made accidents common. Frozen skirts brushed against icy seats, soaking fabric that never dried in time. A maid might stumble on slippery rushes, her torch sputtering out, leaving her in darkness with skirts bunched and dignity shattered. The memory would haunt her long after the frost melted. Scholars still discuss whether noble women truly had better arrangements. Some argue that private garderobes gave them comfort and privacy. Others note that even queens muttered about the cold and smell, proving that rank softened little. Either way, the gendered difference lay in expectation. Men could joke about garderobes, but women carried silence. Chroniclers rarely recorded their complaints, yet their reality was just as bitter. Imagine now a young girl, perhaps a daughter of the household, rushing to the chamber at dawn. She pulls her cloak tight, the corridor dark, her breath quick. She sits nervously, shivering, half afraid of rats, half afraid of being seen. Childhood here meant learning dignity early, even while your legs shook from cold. Her memory of the castle will not be only of feasts and games, it will be of icy boards and whispered warnings about modesty. One curious anecdote tells of a lady in Burgundy who refused to use a garderobe in winter, relying entirely on chamber pots instead. Her servants groaned under the weight of hauling and cleaning, but her decision reveals something plain. Women had fewer choices. If they wanted dignity, they endured the chamber pot's smell. If they wanted relief from smell, they braved the icy shaft. Neither was merciful. And yet, women found ways to adapt. Some layered extra skirts as padding, others timed their visits to avoid crowds, slipping into garderobes during lulls in the day. Maids whispered tips to each other, how to hover, how to tuck fabric, how to keep frost from staining cloth. These little strategies passed quietly, unrecorded in chronicles, yet essential to survival. You step back into the hall now, imagining their hidden burdens. The fire warms you, but the thought lingers. Behind every tapestry of knights and lords, behind every feast and dance, women endured their own struggles with cold stone and icy draughts. Their stories may be absent from chronicles, but the walls remember. You sip a mug of warm ale, the sweetness cutting the memory of frost, and realize the truth. Winter toilets were not just about endurance, they were about dignity, layered differently for men and women, but biting equally when the cold sank in. The fire hums steadily, the hall alive with talk and laughter, yet your thoughts drift back to the women of the castle, their whispered strategies, their petals in pots, their shivering walks down icy corridors. But women weren't the only vulnerable ones. Children, too, had to navigate these frozen garderobes, and their experiences were even more precarious. Tonight, you find yourself imagining the castle through their eyes, perched on smaller bodies, struggling against cold seats built for adults, facing fears far larger than themselves. Picture a boy no older than 7, stumbling from his bed in the barracks where servant children sometimes slept. His breath fogs in the dark, and he clutches a torch stub, the flame barely enough to light his steps. His mother, busy with morning chores, cannot guide him, so he makes the walk alone. The corridor yawns with shadow, the draught whistles around corners, and every sound magnifies in his ears the scuttle of rats, the creak of timbers, the moan of winter wind. For him, the garderobe is not just cold, it is frightening. When he reaches the little chamber, the seat looms above him, cut for adults, rough with frost. He hoists himself up, skirts of his tunic brushing icy stone, and sits trembling. The draught from below feels endless, biting straight through his thin frame. He clings to the board, terrified of slipping, terrified of falling into the shaft that seems to suck at him. One chronicler's tale, perhaps exaggerated, speaks of a child who fell into a garderobe and was rescued only after hours of digging. Whether truth or warning, the fear was real, and every child who perched above that dark hole must have imagined the same fate. Archaeological surveys show how dangerous these spaces could be. Shafts were sometimes wide enough for a small body to slip through. In winter, frost made boards slick. A child's fingers, numb with cold, could lose grip. Parents must have whispered warnings, and children must have carried them like nightmares into their restless sleep. But children also found mischief here. One odd discovery from cesspits is the presence of toys, wooden dolls, carved animals, marbles accidentally or deliberately dropped down shafts. Were they offerings to boredom? Accidents during play? Or pranks, tossed down to hear the splash below. Imagine children giggling as they leaned over the shaft, daring each other to throw in a toy, only to scatter in fright when a servant's voice echoed down the corridor. And then there's the matter of cleaning. Older children, especially those of servant families, often helped with chores. That meant hauling pots, scattering straw, even scraping frozen filth. Imagine a boy of 12, bundled in rags, swinging a shovel against the icy crust, his hands red, his nose dripping, his eyes watering from the smell. He dreams of being a soldier one day, but for now his battle is against frozen waste. Curiously, some folklore even hints that children invented games around the garderobe. One German tale describes boys daring each other to sit the longest in winter, to prove their bravery. The loser would run back crying, legs numb, while the winner boasted until spring. You can almost hear the laughter, sharp and high in the icy corridors, a moment of levity carved out of misery. Yet the risks were ever present. Illness followed children more swiftly, their bodies weaker against draughts and filth. Parasites thrived in their hair and clothes, fleas spreading from garderobe rats into bedding. Parents must have worried, though chroniclers rarely wrote of it. To history, children were shadows in the castle, their voices faint, their stories lost. But the walls remember. Scholars remain divided on how seriously medieval households tried to adapt garderobes for children. Some argue that chamber pots were the default solution, safer and warmer. Others point to the sheer number of child-sized accidents recorded in cesspit archaeology as proof that they too used the chutes. Perhaps the truth is both chamber pots by night, garderobes by day, risks unavoidable either way. Imagine now a girl, perhaps 9 years old, stepping into her family's chamber. She pulls the curtain aside, lifts her skirts carefully, and sits on a cold board that nearly swallows her frame. She wriggles nervously, holding her breath against the draught, muttering a prayer she learned from her nurse. She finishes quickly, leaps down and scampers back beneath her blankets, hiding from the cold as much as from her own fear. That memory will stay with her, shaping how she remembers castle life, always the cold, always the draught, always the worry of falling. There is humour here too, though tinged with unease. Imagine parents chuckling nervously at their children's complaints. The seat bit me. The wind whistled a song. They laugh, but they know the child isn't exaggerating. The garderobe truly does bite, and the wind truly does sing through the shafts. Childhood and fear are bound together in these stone corridors. You walk back now to the hall, where children chase each other between benches, their laughter ringing. None of the chroniclers mention their nightly trips, their scraped fingers, their trembling in cold chambers. But you know it was part of their world, as real as games by the fire or lessons in the chapel. You settle near the hearth again, the warmth chasing shadows from your skin. And you realize that medieval childhood was not just about play or prayer, it was also about courage in small, icy rooms, about facing draughts and darkness with wide eyes, about carrying fear and laughter together into the long winters of the castle. The laughter of children fades into the background of the great hall, replaced by the steady murmur of voices and the clink of goblets. You sit by the fire, warmed at last, but you know that outside these walls the world is colder still. Castles did not exist in isolation. Villages clustered nearby, their people facing the same winter winds, the same frozen ground, the same urgent needs of the body. Yet their solutions to toilets in the coldest months were simpler, rougher, and often harsher than anything inside the fortress. Tonight, you walk beyond the gates to see how ordinary folk endured. Step into a peasant's cottage. The roof is thatched, the floor earthen, the walls patched with wattle and daub. The hearth glows faintly, but the room is chilly. A family huddles beneath blankets, their breath visible in the air. When someone needs relief, there is no stone shaft or decorated pot. Instead, a wooden bucket stands in the corner, or a crude clay vessel, lined with straw. It is used through the night, then carried out in the morning to be emptied into a midden heap behind the cottage. In winter, The contents often freeze before dawn, clinking like brittle lumps when poured. One firmly recorded detail from manorial accounts is the ubiquity of middens open heaps of waste mixed with kitchen scraps and animal dung. These heaps sat near homes, sometimes covered with straw, sometimes simply left exposed. In January, they became frozen mounds, steaming faintly in the morning sun. Chickens scratched at them, dogs sniffed, and children dared each other to climb the crusted sides. Imagine the sight. A pale landscape dotted with little hills of frozen refuse, as much a part of village life as fields or wells. Curiously, these heaps were not only nuisances, they were resources. Once thawed, the waste was spread on fields as fertilizer. A peasant trudging through the snow with a bucket of frozen dung knew it would feed the spring barley. It was foul, yes, but it was also survival. The cycle of filth and food was intimate, unavoidable, and accepted. You picture a man in rough woolen hose, his boots caked with frost, heaving a frozen lump onto the pile with a grunt, muttering that it would make the turnips grow tall. There's humour in the rustic details too. Folklore tells of villagers joking that winter toilets were cleaner because the cold dulled the smell. Some claimed you could sit in peace when the frost bit hardest. Others teased that frozen lumps were easier to carry, as though that were a blessing. You can almost hear the laughter of neighbours at the village well, each trying to one-up the other with tales of winter waste. But misery lurked as well. Without garderobes or enclosed pits, peasants often used the edges of fields or nearby woods. In snow, this meant crouching in the open, cloak lifted, body shivering, praying the wind didn't cut too sharply. The footprints leading to and from such spots must have been familiar sights on winter mornings. Crooked trails ending in little circles pressed into snow, the evidence covered by the next storm. Some accounts suggest people even used the barn, sitting near the animals where warmth lingered faintly. Imagine crouching in straw beside a cow, the air heavy with manure, but at least spared the cutting wind. The line between human and animal needs blurred, survival stripping away refinement. Historians debate whether village privies existed at all in colder regions. Some excavations show pits lined with wood or stone near cottages, evidence that at least some effort was made to create simple toilets. Others argue that middens and open fields were the norm, especially in poorer communities. The truth again is likely both. Where resources allowed, pits were dug. Where they didn't, the snow became the default solution. Children in villages faced the same terrors as their counterparts in castles. Parents warned them not to stray too far at night, lest they stumble into pits or slip on frozen ground. Yet accidents surely happened. A mitten dropped into a midden, a boot lost in the slush, a child tumbling down in laughter only to rise smeared and shivering. These moments, absent from chronicles, lived in memory and story, passed down with humour and warning intertwined. And then there is the contrast. From the castle walls, nobles looked down at villages, seeing smoke rise from chimneys and figures trudging across fields. They may have thought themselves removed, protected by stone and attendants, but their lives were bound together. The waste of nobles, carted out by servants, often ended in the same fields that peasants tilled. The same frost that froze the castle shafts hardened the village middens. Rich or poor, all bent their bodies in the cold, all muttered curses into the winter wind. You stand now in the village street, snow crunching underfoot. To your left, a midden heap steams faintly. To your right, footprints lead to the edge of the woods. The air smells of smoke and dung, sharp but oddly familiar. A woman carries a bucket past you, her breath white in the air, her face lined with frost. She empties it onto the pile without comment, then hurries back inside. The rhythm is endless, silent, accepted. As you turn back toward the castle, the contrast sharpens in your mind. Stone towers rise above, banners flutter in the wind, fires glow in the hall. But beneath the grandeur, the same needs persist. Castle or cottage, lord or peasant, all face the cold, All endure the draught. All carry the burden of frozen toilets in the bitterest months. You step once more into the warmth of the great hall, cloak heavy with frost, heart heavy with realization. History may tell stories of kings and knights, but the true common thread is here: the cold, the filth, the endurance shared by everybody in winter. You return to the great hall for the last time, the fire blazing bright, faces glowing in its warmth. Yet as you sit, you know this is not the whole story. Castles were never only about stone and banners, feasts and battles. They were also about the endless cycle of the body, about toilets in winter, frozen shafts, steaming middens, and the unseen labor that kept everything moving. Tonight, as the hall quiets and shadows lengthen, you reflect on how all these threads weave together into one tapestry of survival. Think of the nobles in their curtained garderobes, shivering despite velvet and incense. Think of the monks in their communal halls, rows of silent bodies enduring draughts as discipline. Think of the servants bent over frozen pots, their hands cracked from cold, scraping and scattering ash. Think of the children trembling on high boards, terrified of falling into the dark. Think of the peasants crouched in snowdrifts, muttering curses into the wind, their waste-feeding fields that would one day supply the castle table. Everywhere, the same truth emerges. In the coldest winters, the act of relieving oneself was never simple, never private, never free from hardship. The garderobe was a stage where class distinctions blurred. Kings and peasants alike sat on icy boards, endured biting draughts, and left behind the same frozen traces. The only difference was whether someone else carried the burden afterward. Archaeology tells us this clearly. From cesspits beneath great keeps to middens behind cottages, the frozen layers reveal the same seeds, the same bones, the same parasites. The walls may differ, the fires may burn brighter in one place than another, but the body's needs cut through every boundary. And in winter, those needs turned into trials of endurance, shaping memories, habits, and even humor. There are strange ironies in this history. Toilets, which symbolized weakness in sieges, were also weapons when defenders dumped filth on their foes. Waste, despised in the hall, became fertilizer in the fields. Cold, hated for its draughts and icy seats, offered relief by dulling smells and slowing disease. Misery and utility walked hand in hand, just as surely as servants carried buckets at dawn. Debates linger among historians about whether snow was widely used for wiping, whether children often fell into shafts, whether nobles truly enjoyed more comfort than peasants. The evidence is patchy, the interpretations varied. Yet in one sense, it hardly matters. The lived reality was hardship. Frost bit, draughts howled, and every soul in a medieval winter castle learned that dignity could vanish the moment you lowered yourself onto an icy board. As you sip your last mug of warm ale in the imagined hall, the fire crackling low, you realize the story has carried you through every corner, from moats that froze into grotesque mirrors of waste, to pits that whispered with ghostly sounds, to chambers where herbs and incense fought a losing battle against stench. You've seen noble velvet stained, children's toys lost in shafts, servants sneaking warmth in jokes, and peasants trudging through snow with buckets. All of it together paints the truest picture of medieval winter life, not grand, but gritty, not heroic, but human. Now let the pace slow. Imagine the torches dimming one by one, shadows stretching across stone. The chatter of the hall fades to silence, save for the soft crack of embers. Outside, snow drifts softly against the walls, blanketing moat and midden alike. Inside, people curl beneath cloaks, drifting into uneasy sleep, chamber pots tucked beneath beds, waiting for morning. The servants settle too, their shovels leaned against walls, their breath finally at rest. Even the rats quiet, huddled in nests of straw, waiting for spring. You close your eyes, picturing the castle wrapped in frost. The towers stand proud, banners stiff in the frozen wind, yet within, every chamber breathes with human need. It is humbling, almost comforting, to know that the mighty and the meek alike shared this reality. History may speak of crowns and battles, but the true story lies in the cold stone chambers, where all were equal before the draft. And now, let your own breath soften. Let the memory of icy corridors fade. Let the sound of dripping water recede. Let the smell of herbs and frost dissolve into silence. You are safe, warm, and far from those freezing garderobes. The castle settles, the night deepens, and your mind drifts gently downward, away from filth and fear, into the calm embrace of sleep. The journey through medieval castles has been long and detailed, and now the time has come to let it all drift away. You've walked the icy corridors, peered into frozen shafts, and sat beside servants carrying buckets at dawn. You've glimpsed the life of nobles behind velvet curtains, monks lined in silence, children shivering on high boards, and peasants crouched in snowdrifts. Each detail has shown how even the smallest necessities shaped life, weaving dignity, hardship, and resilience into the very fabric of the Middle Ages. But as the night deepens, you don't need to carry those images anymore. Let the sound of dripping water soften into nothing. Let the cold draughts you imagined melt into a quiet breeze. The crackle of the hall fire fades, leaving only warmth, gentle and steady, wrapping around you like a blanket. The smell of herbs and incense drifts away, leaving clean, silent air. The scurrying of rats, the creak of wooden seats, the splash of frozen waste, all of it dissolves, leaving you in stillness. Take a slow breath. Picture snow falling quietly outside the walls, each flake muffling the world, softening its edges, erasing its harshness. The castle no longer feels drafty or cold. It is only a silhouette under moonlight, peaceful, timeless, and calm. Inside, every sound is hushed, every fire banked low, every person asleep. The burdens of winter toilets are gone. What remains is quiet endurance, the kind that carried humanity forward century after century. You are part of that story, but tonight you do not need to think of hardship. Tonight you rest. The castle stands guard in your imagination, its stones strong, its halls silent, its towers bright beneath the stars. You are safe, you are warm, you are at peace. Drift gently now,